Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world where the shadows are just a trick of the light, but a place where you have to live, breathe, and survive. Imagine yourself standing in a cramped, dim basement in the heart of occupied Minsk. The air is thick with the scent of mildew, unwashed wool, and the sharp, earthy tang of raw tubers. Above your head, the rhythmic thud of jackboots on the pavement acts as a metronome for your anxiety, a constant reminder that the world upstairs wants you gone. You are hunched over a rickety wooden table, illuminated by the flickering, greasy flame of a single tallow candle. Your hands are stained not with blood, though that's always a possibility, but with a mixture of purple ink and gray starch. In front of you lies a common potato, sliced clean down the middle, its pale, wet face staring back at you like a blank canvas. This isn't dinner, this is a master key. You are about to carve a Nazi state seal into a vegetable because, in this upside-down reality, a well-placed smudge of starch is the only thing standing between a family and a cattle car bound for the east. It's a high-stakes game of arts and crafts, where a slipped blade doesn't just mean a cut finger. It means a death sentence. Honestly, looking at your shaky hands right now, you probably wouldn't survive this UD. Likely slip and carve a smiley face into the Reich. Eagle by mistake, and that's a one-way ticket to a very bad time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from tonight. So go ahead and post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel while we all tucked away in our own corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the cold seep through your thin soles as you shift your weight. The basement is a tomb of secrets. This is the nerve center of a Jewish partisan cell, and your role is technical expert, which is a fancy way of saying you're the person who makes the impossible look official. The mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in the grand, sweeping narratives of tank battles and pincer movements is that the survival of thousands depended entirely on the bureaucratic obsession of the Third Reich. The Nazis loved their paperwork. If you didn't have a paper trail, you didn't exist, and if you didn't exist, you were liquidated. This obsession was their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. You realize that to save a life, you don't need a gun, you need a fountain pen and a sharp knife. A quirky fringe tidbit about these underground forger dens is that they often doubled as actual kitchens. If the Gestapo burst in, you couldn't exactly hide a printing press, but you could certainly be found preparing a stew. You'd have to be ready to throw your evidence, the carved stamps and the incriminating peels, into a boiling pot of water at a moment's notice. Imagine the sheer nerves required to eat your own forgery tools while an officer snoops around your pantry. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these potato stamps was due to the quality of the carving or simply the sheer volume of paperwork the German soldiers had to process, leading to a fatigue of the eyes that let minor imperfections slide. You pick up a small surgical scalpel, stolen from a local infirmary, and look at the Ken card spread before you. This is the basic identification card, the literal difference between breathing and not. It requires a specific shade of blue-green ink and a stamp that bears the circular seal of the Polis president. You take a deep breath, trying to still the tremors in your fingers. The humidity in the basement is your enemy. It makes the paper soft and the potato slick. You've already ruined 3 tubers tonight. One was too mealy and crumbled under the blade. Another was too small for the eagle's wingspan. This fourth one, is firm. It's a sturdy, reliable Belarusian potato, the kind that usually ends up as a pancake but is currently auditioning for the role of a lifetime. You begin to shave the surface of the potato to create a perfectly flat plane. You can't use a ruler. You have to rely on your eyes, which are straining in the low light. Every second counts. In the corner of the room, a young courier waits in silence. She's barely 20, wearing a headscarf and a coat that's seen better decades. She needs these papers to get a family of 4 out of the ghetto and into the Naliboki forest by dawn. No pressure, right? You think about how absurd it is that the fate of a mother and 3 children rests on your ability to carve a tiny swastika into a root vegetable. It's the kind of dark irony that stays with you, a joke told in whispers that nobody really finds funny. As you work, you have to remember to carve everything in reverse. It's a common mistake for beginners. You Spend 3 hours perfecting the Gothic lettering of a city name, only to realize, when you press it to paper, that you've printed a mirror image that looks like gibberish. You have to think backwards to move forwards. You focus on the A in Ausweis. You carve out the negative space, leaving the thin ridges of the letter standing proud. The starch starts to oxidize, turning the white flesh of the potato a brownish gray, which actually helps you see the contrast of your work. You think back to how you ended up here. You weren't a master engraver before the war. Maybe you were a student, an artist, or even just someone who was good at whittling wood to pass the time. War has a way of turning hobbies into survival skills. You remember a fellow forger once told you that the best ink isn't found in a bottle, but in the bottom of a coffee pot. If you boil it down enough, it gets that sticky, permanent quality that mimics the official Reich supplies. It's these little hacks, these desperate improvisations, that form the backbone of the resistance. The silence in the basement is punctuated by the occasional drip of water from a pipe and the distant, muffled bark of a guard dog. You try not to think about the dog. You focus on the eagle's feathers. The German eagle is a majestic, terrifying symbol of power. But under your knife, it's just a series of tiny geometric lines. You're deconstructing the symbol of your oppressor, one sliver of starch at a time. It's a quiet form of rebellion, a way of saying that their grand, thousand-year bureaucracy can be undone by a person in a basement with a grocery item. Finally, you finish the seal. Your neck is stiff and your eyes ache. Now comes the moment of truth. You take a scrap of practice paper, nothing official, yet you can't afford to waste a real blank. You dip a small brush into your homemade ink, a concoction of soot and methylated spirits, and lightly coat the surface of the potato. You press it down. Your heart hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. You lift the potato. The mark is clear. It's not perfect. There's a slight blur on the left wing, but in the dim light of a street lamp at a checkpoint. It will pass. It has to pass. You look up at the courier, nodding slowly. She doesn't smile. She just reaches for the finished document. You watch her tuck it into her boot, a piece of paper that carries the weight of the world. You pick up the next potato. The night is long, and there are many more officials to be carved before the sun comes up. Now that you've successfully tested your stamp on a scrap of waste paper, you have to face the daunting reality of the document itself. You aren't just stamping a flyer. You are interacting with a masterpiece of German engineering. The Ken card, or the basic ID card, isn't just a piece of paper. It's a sophisticated psychological weapon designed to make you feel caught before you've even been stopped. You pull a genuine, albeit expired, specimen toward you to study it. It's a bifold card, typically printed on oilcloth or heavy cardstock, usually in a dull, bureaucratic shade of gray or olive. It feels substantial in your hand, heavy, textured, and intimidating. You run your thumb over the surface, feeling the slight, raised quality of the print. This is the visual language of the Third Reich, a dialect of authority that speaks in sharp angles, fractal script, and concentric circles. Every fiber of this paper is a barrier, a physical manifestation of a regime that lives and breathes through categorization. You realize that your potato stamp is only 10% of the battle. The other 90% is understanding the bleed. You see, official stamps use oil-based inks that penetrate the paper fibers in a specific way, whereas your water-based potato juice and soot concoction tend to sit on the surface, like a puddle on a frozen pond. If you press too hard, the starch creates a telltale halo around the letters, a ghosting effect that would catch the eye of even the most bored desk clerk. You have to learn the physics of the paper. This is where your modern host's perspective kicks in. You basically trying to run a high-definition print job on a piece of toast using a sponge. Honestly, given that most of us can't even get a home printer to work without an inklo tantrum, your chances of pulling this off in a freezing basement are slim to none. You'd probably end up with a purple thumbprint and a very awkward conversation with a man in a trench coat. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Ken cart was introduced in 1938 specifically to track unreliable elements of the population, and for Jewish citizens, it was marked with a bold, distinctive J. Your job is to create a card that is missing that J, or better yet, one that replaces it with a convincing Aryan heritage. But it's not just the letter. There are the fingerprints. The card requires 2 fingerprints, one from each index finger. You look at your own soot-stained tips. You have to be careful not to leave your own identity on someone else's lifeline. A quirky, fringe tidbit of the forger's world is that some partisan cells actually kept libraries of fingerprints. They would find people who had died of natural causes or who had fled, and they would carefully lift their prints using a mixture of gelatin and glycerin to create finger pads for the new holders of the documents. It's morbid, yes, but in the business of survival, the dead often help the living. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these documents was an intentional trap or simply a byproduct of the German love for over-engineering. Some suggest the intricate background patterns, those tiny swirling lines called galoche, were specifically designed to be impossible to replicate by hand. Yet, here you are, using a sharpened sewing needle to scratch similar patterns into the wax coating of your counterfeit card. You have to mimic the way the light hits the ink. Official ink has a slight sheen, a metallic glimmer that comes from the lead and iron content. Your homemade ink is matte. To fix this, Uwe discovered a trick. If you breathe on the ink just as it is drying, the moisture from your lungs adds a microscopic layer of condensation that, when it evaporates, leaves a faint, oily-looking residue. It's a delicate dance of chemistry and biology. You look at the photograph that needs to be attached. In the 1940s, photos weren't just glued on, they were slid. You have to use a small metal punch to create two perfect holes and then crimp a metal ring through the paper in the photo. If the eyelid is too shiny, it looks new suspicious. If it's too dull, it looks like it was salvaged from a scrap heap. You take a bit of dirt from the basement floor and rub it into the metal until it has the muted, cynical glow of something that has lived through a war. Everything about this card needs to scream boring. You want the guard at the checkpoint to look at it and feel a sense of profound apathy. If they are interested in the document, you've already lost. You are aiming for the bureaucratic camouflage of the mundane. The script on the card is another nightmare. The Germans used a specific typeface, and while you are hand-altering some of the details, you have to ensure that kerning the space between the letters is mathematically precise. You use a magnifying glass salvaged from an old watchmaker's kit. Through the lens, the paper looks like a vast snowy landscape, and your pen nib is a plow. One slip, one slightly too long tail on a G, and the illusion shatters. You think about the irony. You are using the tools of an artist to create the most soul-crushingly unartistic thing imaginable. You are a ghostwriter for the state, penning the autobiography of a person who doesn't exist, so that a person who does exist can keep on doing so. You also have to consider the series letters. Every district had its own code. If you issue a card with a Berlin prefix to someone living in a village outside of Minsk, you're handing them a death warrant. You have to be a geographer, a historian, and a spy all at once. You keep a small, handwritten ledger of known prefixes, cross-referenced with the dates of occupation. It's a lot of data to manage without a spreadsheet, isn't it? Remember that time you forgot your own Wi-Fi password? Yeah, now imagine forgetting which regional code corresponds to a suburb of Krakow, while a man with a submachine gun waits for you to finish. As you finish the fine lining, you realize the document is too clean. It looks like it just came off a press, which it shouldn't. A real ID card has been in a wallet, sat on, spilled on, and handled with sweaty palms. You take the card and begin the distressing process. This is the heart of the forgery, the soul of the lie. You aren't just forging a document, you're forging a history. You lightly sandpaper the edges. You take a drop of weak tea and create a faint ring on the back, as if the owner once set a damp glass down near it in a moment of exhaustion. This is the lived-in look. It's the difference between a prop and a tool. You feel a strange sense of pride in this corruption of the paper. By making it look worse, you're making it better. The courier shifts in the corner, her breathing a soft, rhythmic sound in the dark. She's waiting for the product. You realize that to her, you aren't an artist or a chemist, you're a factory. But to you, every stroke of the pen is a heartbeat. You look at the completed in the flickering candlelight, it looks perfect. It looks like nothing. It looks like 1,000 other cards being carried in 1,000 other pockets. And that is its greatest strength. It is perfectly, beautifully, ordinary. You pick up the next blank sheet, your back beginning to throb with a dull ache that you know won't leave until the war does. While the potato is your primary tool for the crude seals, you soon realize that a stamp is useless if you can change the text on the original document. This brings you to the legend of Adolf Kaminsky, a name whispered in the underground as the patron saint of the clean slate. You are now channeling his teenage genius. Kaminsky was a dye specialist turned courier before the war, and he discovered that the most dangerous part of a document wasn't the blank space, but the ink already there. Specifically, the J for Juif, or the name that didn't match your new, forged identity. You sit at your bench, staring at a genuine document that needs a name change. In the 1940s, ink wasn't just a surface stain, it was a chemical bond. If you tried to scrape it off with a razor, you'd thin the paper. And the moment a guard held it up to the light, a common tactic, the scratch marks would glow like a neon sign. You pick up a small glass vial of lactic acid. This is Kaminsky's secret. He realized that the blue and black inks used by the authorities were susceptible to specific chemical reagents. You dip a very fine brush, one made from just 3 or 4 hairs, to the acid. Your task is to perform a chemical exorcism. You have to dissolve the ink without dissolving the wood pulp fibers of the paper. It is a terrifyingly slow process. You apply a microscopic drop to the letter S in a surname. You watch, holding your breath, as the ink begins to bleed and pale. Then, you use a piece of high-quality blotting paper to lift the liquid. If you're too fast, the ink spreads into a permanent blue bruise. If you're too slow, the acid eats a hole straight through to the table. Honestly, most of us can even get a wine stain out of a rug without making it worse. Trying to chemically erase a state-mandated identity while your heart is doing 120 beats per minute is a level of stress that would make a modern high-pressure job look like a spa day. The mainstream historical fact here is that Adolf Kaminsky, working for the French resistance and later the Jewish clandestine networks, was responsible for saving an estimated 14,000 lives. He was barely 18 when he started. He worked in a lab disguised as a commercial photography studio, which gave him a perfect cover for the chemicals he needed. A quirky, fringe tidbit of his process involved the use of a hairdryer, a luxury item at the time. He found that by rapidly heating the paper after the chemical treatment, he could reset the fibers, making the surface look undisturbed. He would then use a dilute solution of yellow tea to re-edge the bleached spot so it matched the slightly oxidized tone of the rest of the document. He wasn't just a forger, he was a cosmetic surgeon for stationery. Historians still argue whether Kaminsky's greatest contribution was his chemical formulas or his rigorous quality control protocols. He was known to be a perfectionist who would burn an entire batch of documents if a single comma looked slightly too fat. You adopt that same ruthless standard. You look at the spot where the name used to be. It's blank now, a tiny white ghost on the gray paper. Now comes the hard part. Ranking, you have to match the original penmanship of the clerk who first issued the card. This requires a fluidity of the wrist. You practice the signature on the back of an old receipt. You aren't just copying letters. You are mimicking the speed and pressure of a bored bureaucrat in 1941. If the line is too shaky, it looks like a forgery. If it's too perfect, it looks suspicious. You want it to look efficiently messy. You think about the ink of the enemy. The Germans often used a specific type of indelible ink that contained iron gall. Over time, this ink actually bites into the paper, turning a brownish black as the iron oxidizes. To replicate this, you've experimented with crushed oak galls and rusty nails soaked in vinegar. It's medieval chemistry being used to fight a modern industrial war. You realize that your workspace is a bridge between centuries. You have the surgical tools of the 20th century, the chemical knowledge of a dye maker, and the raw materials of an 18th century scribe. It's a bizarre, frantic synthesis. As you work, you remember the crocodile dung sunscreen callback, not because you're using dung, thank goodness, but because the history of humanity is a history of using weird materials to solve impossible problems. In your case, you've discovered that a tiny bit of earwax can be used to seal the paper fibers after you've used acid on them, preventing the new ink from feathering out like a spiderweb. It's gross, sure, but it works. You're a scientist of the You're looking for any edge, any tiny trick that will keep the person carrying this card out of a prison cell. The weight of the responsibility is starting to settle in your shoulders. Kaminsky famously said, "Stay awake as long as possible. Fight sleep." The equation is simple. In 1 hour, I can make 30 documents. If I sleep for 1 hour, 30 people will die. You look at the clock. It's 3 a.m. Your eyes are burning from the fumes of the lactic acid and the dim light. You feel the pull of exhaustion, a heavy blanket trying to wrap itself around your mind. But then you look at the names on your list. Names of children, names of grandfathers. You realize that sleep is a luxury you can't afford. You are a factory of time. Every minute you spend at this table buys someone else a lifetime. You take a sip of cold, bitter chicory coffee. It tastes like dirt, but it keeps the shadows at the edge of your vision from closing in. You pick up the fountain pen again. The ghost of the erased name is gone, and the new name, a good, safe, non-distinctive name, is ready to be born. You align the nib. You visualize the stroke. You think about how Kaminsky survived the war and continued forgers' work for decades, helping decolonization movements and anti-apartheid activists, never taking a penny for his work. He lived in the shadows because that's where he was most effective. You realize that you are part of a long, invisible lineage. You are the person who writes the lies that tell the truth, that these people deserve to live. The new ink flows onto the paper. It sits perfectly. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't feather. You use the hairdryer trick, the low hum of the machine, a strange domestic sound in the middle of a war zone. When you're done, the paper looks untouched. Even under your magnifying glass, the transition is seamless. You've successfully performed a miracle with a bit of acid and a lot of nerve. You set the document aside to dry and reach for the next one. There are still 28 people on tonight's list, 28 lives waiting to be edited back into existence. The chemistry of ink erasure is a delicate art, but eventually, you have to return to the physical impression, the stamp. You reach for a fresh potato, and as you slice it, you start to consider the sheer biological brilliance of the tuber. You aren't just using a potato because the grocery store was out of rubber. You are using it because of its cellular architecture. A potato is essentially a high-density, moisture-locked starch matrix. When you cut it, the cells release a microscopic layer of liquid that acts as a natural adhesive for pigments. This is the humble potato's unexpected porousness. Unlike a block of wood, which might soak up too much ink and swell, or a piece of metal, which might repel water-based dyes. The potato offers a Goldilocks level of absorption. It holds the ink on its surface long enough for a transfer, but doesn't let it soak into the core of the vegetable. You realize that the starch content is your secret weapon. As the potato juice dries on the paper, it leaves behind a faint, translucent residue, a microscopic sheen that oddly mimics the look of a heavy-duty industrial stamp. It's a bit of organic luck in a very inorganic war. Honestly, if you tried to explain this to a modern craft enthusiast, they'd probably try to sell you an artisanal organic document kit for $50. But here in the basement, it's just survival. You probably wouldn't survive the grocery bill for this operation today, let alone the Gestapo. You'd get distracted trying to make the perfect French fry out of the leftovers. The mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is that the use of food for forgery was unlimited to Minsk or the Jewish partisans. It was a widespread technique across occupied Europe, including the French resistance, and even some Allied POW camps. Potatoes were the 3D printers of the 1940s. They were cheap, ubiquitous, and, most importantly, disposable. If the authorities knocked, you didn't have a sophisticated engraving tool to hide, you just had a half-eaten dinner. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the specific variety of potato used. In Eastern Europe, forgers preferred the lumper, or older starchier varieties, because they were firmer. A waxy new potato was the enemy of the resistance to much water, not enough structural integrity. You need a potato that has lived a little, one that has a bit of grit in its skin. Historians still argue whether the potato method was actually more effective than professional rubber stamps, because the slight organic irregularities made each stamp look unique. In the Third Reich's bureaucracy, every local office had its own hand-inked stamp, and those stamps wore down over time. A perfectly crisp, machine-perfect stamp was actually more suspicious than one with a slightly soft edge. Your potato, by its very nature, creates that human imperfection. It suggests a board clerk who didn't T-press down hard enough, or a stamp that has been used 10,000 times. You are forging the exhaustion of the system itself. You start to prep the surface of the slice. You use a piece of fine silk stolen from a discarded scarf to buff the potato face until it's as smooth as glass. You have to remove the weeping moisture. If the surface is too wet, the ink will run like a watercolor painting. You're looking for that perfect window of tacky dryness. This is the physics of the vegetable that no one taught you in school. You think about the irony of your education. You might have studied literature or law, but your most important degree right now is in tuber technology. It's a specialized field with a very high pass or die rate. As you prepare to carve, you remember the crocodile dung lesson using what's at hand, no matter how absurd. You realize that your ink isn't just soot and alcohol. You've started adding a tiny bit of sugar to the mix. Why? Because sugar creates a tack. It makes the ink stick to the potato and then transfer to the paper with a crispness that mimics the oil-based inks of the Reich. It's these tiny fringe discoveries that keep you alive. You're rebuilding a library of street science that will never be published in a textbook, but is being written in the survival of every person who walks out of this basement with a fake ID. The air in the cellar feels heavier now. You can hear the courier breathing, a soft, impatient sound. You look at the potato. It's ready. You have to work fast because the moment you sliced it, a biological clock started ticking. Within an hour, the potato will start to oxidize and soften. Within 3 hours, the intricate lines you've carved will begin to warp as the cells lose water. A potato stamp is a living tool with a very short lifespan. You aren't just a forger, you're a timemetrial athlete. You have to carve ink and stamp an entire batch of documents before the vegetable expires. You take a small, sharpened knitting needle. This will be your primary carving tool for the fine details. You don't start with the big letters. You start with the background grid. You have to create the illusion of depth. You think about how many potatoes have been sacrificed for this cause. Thousands of them, likely a time of famine. Using food for something other than eating feels like a sin. But you tell yourself that a full stomach is useless if you're dead. You are turning calories into freedom. It's a strange conversion rate, but it's the only one that matters right now. You feel a sense of strange connection to the earth as you work. This tuber grew in the soil of the very land you were trying to reclaim. It's a piece of the home front, literally. You find a weird comfort in the smell of its clean, neutral scent that cuts through the metallic temps of the chemicals and the stale air of the basement. You begin the first cut. The needle sinks in with a satisfying tiny pop as it breaks the surface tension of the starch. You're in the zone now. The world above the jackboots, the sirens, the war, it all fades away. There is only the needle, the potato, and the line. You are a surgeon of the mundane, and the patient is the truth. Now, the real test of your nerves begins. The carving of the Reichsadler, the imperial eagle. You aren't just sketching a bird. You are recreating a symbol of absolute authority using a needle and a root vegetable. You stare at the blank, buffed face of your potato slice. You have to remember the golden rule of the forger. Everything is backwards. In your mind's eye, you have to flip the entire world. The eagle's head usually faces its right, which means on your potato, it must face your left. The swastika clutched in its talons, a geometric nightmare for a hand carver, must be rotated in reverse so that it prints correctly. One slip, one branch of the cross pointed the wrong way, and you haven't made a document. You've made a confession. Honestly, most people can't even draw a symmetrical heart on a Valentine's card. So the idea of you carving a high-precision state seal into a wet starch block while the Gestapo prowls the neighborhood is frankly laughable. You'd probably give the eagle a googly eye and call it a day. The mainstream historical fact here is that German official stamps were intentionally designed with security through complexity. The eagle's wings consist of precisely 14 individual feathers on each side, and the circle surrounding the swastika is often composed of a specific number of tiny, raised dots. This wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a way to verify authenticity at a glance. You are essentially trying to hack a 1940s analog firewall with a kitchen utensil, a quirky fringe tidbit of the resistance. Some forgers would actually use a tiny drop of diluted milk to prime the potato surface before carving. The proteins in the milk would create a slightly firmer skin on the starch, allowing for cleaner lines that didn't crumble under the needle. It's like a DIY primer for the most dangerous art project of your life. Historians still argue whether the Germans ever officially realized the extent of the potato underground. Some documents suggest that toward the end of the war, certain SS units were given magnifying loupes specifically to look for the organic grain of a vegetable stamp. However, others argue that the Reich's own supply chain was so fractured by 1944 that their official stamps were often just as poorly made as yours. You're counting on that chaos. You're recounting on the fact that a tired sergeant at a train station is more worried about his own rations than the exact curvature of an eagle's beak. You begin the negative space operation. You aren't carving the lines, you are carving everything around the lines. You use the needle to scoop out the pale flesh of the potato, leaving the thin ridges that will carry the ink. It is agonizing work. You have to breathe in a specific rhythm, holding your breath as you make a stroke, then exhaling slowly once the needle is clear. If you cough, you ruin the wing. If you sneeze, you ruin the family waiting for these papers. You feel like a clockmaker working on a bomb. Every sliver of potato you remove is a tiny step toward a successful lie. You use a damp cloth to constantly wipe away the excess starch that weeps from the cuts. Otherwise, it clogs your grooves and turns your fine lines into a muddy mess. You think back to the crocodile dung philosophy of making do with what you have. You found that if you let the potato sit for exactly 7 minutes after the final carve, the edges of the cuts slightly crisp due to air exposure. This makes the stamp more durable for the first few impressions. You also keep a small piece of coal near your lamp to dry your fingers. Sweaty palms are the forger's curse. You're navigating a world of microscopic variables. You're a scientist of the subterranean, a master of the mundane. You realize that the eagle you are creating is actually a hollow shell symbol. You are draining of its power by replicating it so cheaply. The courier in the corner shifts her feet, the sound of her heavy boots on the stone floor echoing like a heartbeat. She's checking her watch, a small silver piece that belonged to her mother. Time is your most precious resource, and it's bleeding away just like the starch from the potato. You focus on the swastika. It's the smallest part of the stamp, but the most dangerous. It's a series of 4 right angles that must be perfectly balanced. You use the very tip of the needle to pick at the potato, more like an engraver than a carver. You feel the resistance of the vegetable fibers. You're literally carving a path to freedom through a dinner staple. As you finish the last feather, your hand is cramping, a dull throb that reaches all the way to your elbow. You take the practice scrap again. This is the moment where the Mirage logic is tested. You apply the Sutansagar ink. You press down with a firm, rolling motion front to back, then side to side, ensuring the pressure is even. You lift the tuber. The eagle stares back at you. It's sharp, it's arrogant. It looks absolutely, terrifyingly official. You've successfully turned a Belarusian potato into a representative of the Third Reich. It's an absurd, beautiful victory. You look at the courier and give a sharp, quick nod. The first authentic forgery of the night is ready for its permanent home on the Ken cart. You aren't just a person in a basement anymore. You are a ghost in the machine, a glitch in the system that's trying to save itself. You reach for the document, aligning the potato stamp with a steady hand. One press, one life. You feel the weight of the paper beneath the vegetable. It's done. You set the card aside and look at the remaining pile of potatoes. The sun will be up in 4 hours. You pick up the needle and start the next one. With the ink still tacky on the freshly stamped Ken cart, you hand the document to the courier. This is where the basement's safety ends and the courier's walk begins. You watch her tuck the card into the lining of her coat, a movement so practiced it's almost casual. Now the narrative shifts. You are no longer the craftsman. You are the passenger in her journey. You step out of the cellar's gloom and into the blinding, indifferent light of a Minsk morning. The transition is jarring. The smell of the earth and chemicals is replaced by the scent of wood smoke, horse manure, and the metallic tang of military exhaust. Your heart is a drum in your chest, and every person you pass is a potential judge. You aren't just carrying a piece of paper, you're carrying a forged reality. If you believe the document is fake, the guard will see it in the way you hold your shoulders. You have to inhabit the person that the potato stamp says you are. You approach the checkpoint near the Lion's Gate, a bottleneck where the city's life is strained through the fingers of the occupation. The line of people is long, a miserable ribbon of frayed coats and hollow eyes. You feel the forged paper crinkling against your skin, a sensation that feels as loud as a gunshot in the silence of your mind. You think about how absurd it is that your life depends on a starch-based impression. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this walk. You'd get that guilty face people get when they walk through an airport security line, even though they haven't done anything wrong. You'd probably start sweating so much, the ink would run right through your coat. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Jewish couriers, many of whom were young women, were the lifeblood of the resistance. They traveled between ghettos and partisan units, often using forged work permits to explain their movement. They relied on the invisibility of the ordinary. A quirky fringe tidbit about these journeys is that couriers would often carry a distraction item, a basket of stinking leeks, a crying infant, or even a flirtatious smile to ensure the guard spent more time looking at them than at the document. Some couriers even carried poisoned cigarettes to offer to guards, not to kill them, but to make them slightly nauseous and eager to end the interaction quickly. It's a masterclass in psychological warfare conducted with household items. Historians still argue whether the guards were truly fooled by the quality of the forgeries, or if they were often complicit, practicing a form of willful blindness in exchange for the quietude of a processed line. But you can't bet your life on their mercy. You reach the front of the line. The soldier is young, his uniform slightly too big for his frame, his eyes glazed with the boredom of 1,000 identical mornings. He reaches out a gloved hand. "Papier," he barks. This is the checkpoint paradox. You want to be fast enough to avoid suspicion, but slow enough to appear respectful. You pull the Ken card out with a steady hand, or at least, a hand you've forced into steadiness. As he flips open the card, you notice a speck of dirt on his thumb. You focus on that speck. It's a grounding technique. If you look at his eyes, you might see the hunter. If you look at the gun, you might see the end. So you look at the dirt. You remember the crocodile dung lessons. Sometimes the smallest, grossest detail is the most real. You realize that your forgery is currently being judged by a teenager who probably wants to be back in Munich eating a pretzel. The eagle you carved with a needle is now staring him in the face. It's a standoff between a potato and a Reich. A fringe tactic you recall from your training is the stain defense. If the guard looks too closely at a blurred edge, you are supposed to apologize for dropping it in the mud or spilling coffee during a raid. You've pre-weathered the document for this exact moment. You see his eyes skip over the eagle and settle on the stamp of the Labor Office. This is the crucial part. The ink you made from soot and sugar has a slight, convincing tackiness. He runs his thumb over it. If the ink were fresh from a real stamp, it might smudge slightly. Your potatoink, once dried, is surprisingly resilient. The silence stretches. A truck rumbles past, kicking up a cloud of gray dust that makes the soldier squint. For a second, you think you're done for. He pauses on the photograph. He looks at you, then at the grainy, eyelidded image. You aged the photo by rubbing it against a woolen blanket to give it a pocket-worn texture. He sees a tired woman in a headscarf, and he sees the tired woman in front of him. He doesn't see a partisan. He doesn't see a forger's masterpiece. He sees a cog in the machine he's been told to watch. He snaps the card shut and thrusts it back at you. "Vitter," he says, "move on." You take the paper, tucking it back into your pocket. You don't run. You do uneven breathe a sigh of relief until you turned the corner and the lioness gate is a shadow in the distance. Your legs feel like lead, and the crinkle of the paper now sounds like a victory march. You've survived the walk. But you know that tonight you'll be back in that basement, because for every person who walks through the gate, there are 10 more waiting in the dark. You think about the 6th column logistics. Passing the gate is just phase 1. Now you have to deliver these papers to a dead drop a hollowed out brick in a ruined wall or a flower pot in a sympathetic widow's window. The document is a baton in a relay race where the finish line is a forest 3 days away. You realize that the hidden stories of history aren't just about the grand battles, but about these quiet, terrifying walks. They are about the moment the paper changes hands. You feel a strange sense of power. You are an editor of destiny. With a potato and a needle, you've rewritten the ending of one person's story. And as the sun climbs higher over Minsk, you realize the day has only just begun. While the potato provides the form, the ink provides the soul of the deception. You are back at your workbench, but the Sutan-Sagar mixture from earlier isn't enough for the more complex documents, the ones that require the Gestapo purple or the Imperial green. You've become a scavenger of the natural world, a chemist of the kitchen scrap. You realize that the Third Reich's aesthetic isn't just about sharp lines, it's about a specific palette of institutional colors that scream authority. To mimic these, you turn to the humble walnut. You have a sack of green walnut husks sitting in the corner, and as you boil them down in a chipped enamel pot, the basement fills with a heavy tannic scent that sticks to the back of your throat. This isn't just a dye, it's a permanent acidic liquid that bites into the paper, mimicking the iron gall inks used in official records. You watch the liquid reduce, turning from a murky tea color into a deep obsidian black with a slight violet undertone. This is the inks made from boiled walnut shells breakthrough. By adding a rusted nail to the boiling pot, you introduce iron acetate, which reacts with the tannins in the walnut to create a chemical bond so strong it's almost impossible to erase ironically. making your forgery as permanent as the truth it replaces. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the smell of this process today. Your neighbors would call the gas company thinking there was a leak, and you'd be caught before the first drop dried. You'd be the only revolutionary undone by a nuisance odor complaint. The mainstream historical fact here is that the scarcity of resources during the war forced both the occupiers and the resistance into a chemistry of desperation. The German government eventually had to switch to lower quality inks as Allied bombings hit their chemical plants, which actually made your job easier. Their official standards were dropping to meet your underground ones. A quirky fringe tidbit: some forgers used the juice of pressed blueberries mixed with a splash of vinegar to achieve the exact shade of violet used in German railway stamps. If you used too much vinegar, the paper would eventually rot. If you used too little, the color would fade to a suspicious pink in the sunlight. You're balancing on a knife edge of pH levels. Historians still argue whether the organic nature of these homemade inks actually helped the forgeries survive the war better than synthetic ones. Some suggest that because these natural dyes were similar to what local village scribes had used for centuries, they didn't look new or industrial, which helped them blend into the local bureaucracy. You are essentially using the ancient chemistry of the land to deceive a modern industrial invader. You take a glass-dipped pen and test the walnut ink on a corner of your map. It flows smoothly, leaving a rich, dark line that looks like it's been there for 100 years. You also need a way to create the stamp pad. You can't just dip a potato into a pot of boiling walnut juice. You need a medium that holds the ink and releases it evenly. You've found that a slice of old, compressed felt from the brim of a discarded hat works perfectly. You soak the felt in your walnut tangerine concoction, then place it inside a small tin boxer, tobacco tin perhaps. This is your portable press. You press the potato eagle into the felt, and it emerges with a thin, even coat of deep purple-black. It looks lethal. It looks like it belongs on a desk in Berlin. As you work, you remember the crocodile dung lesson again. It's about the repurposing of the discarded. Juve started using the silver foil from old cigarette packs to burnish the ink once it S on the paper. By rubbing the foil gently over the dried stamp, you transfer a microscopic amount of metallic dust, giving the ink that industrial sheen that raw vegetable juice lacks. It's a tiny fringe detail that Ninatinin, out of 100 guards, would never notice. But it's the 100th guard, the one who takes his job seriously, that you're worried about. You're building a defense against the perfectionist. The basement air is getting colder, and your breath puffs out in little white clouds. The steam from the walnut pot provides the only warmth, a humid, earthy heat. Think about how many different layers of forgery you're managing. You have the potato for the seal, the walnut for the ink, the lactic acid for the erasure, and the sugar for the tack. You are a one-man industrial revolution occurring in 10 square feet of damp stone. You feel a strange sense of kinship with the alchemists of old, trying to turn leaden lives into golden futures through the power of a bubbling cauldron. You take the next document, a travel permit for a partisan scout hand. Prepare to apply the walnut ink. This document is larger, more complex, and requires multiple stamps. You have to be careful not to cross-contaminate your colors. You keep a separate potato for each department. The Ministry of Transport is a slightly larger tuber, its edges already starting to soften. You realize you'll need to carve a new one by tomorrow. The biological clock of the potato is a constant pressure, a reminder that your tools are as mortal as the people you're trying to save. You dip your brush into the walnut reduction and touch up a faint line in the eagle's talons. The ink is perfect. It has that slightly crusty look when it dries thick, just like the real thing. You feel a grim satisfaction. The Nazis wanted to use science to categorize and destroy. You are using science to smudge their lines and hide the untraceable. You are the ghost in their ledger, the ink blot on their master plan. You set the permit aside to dry, the walnut scent lingering on your fingers like a badge of office. You pick up the next potato, your knife ready to begin the cycle again. Even with the perfect walnut ink and a crisp potato seal, your document still has one glaring problem. It looks too new. In a world of mud, sweat, and coal dust, a pristine identification card is a red flag. You need to perform the art of the aged document, a process of deliberate destruction that requires the touch of a forger and the soul of an actor. You hold the fresh Ken card in your hands. It's beautiful, too beautiful. If a guard sees this, he won't see a citizen. He'll see a printing press. You have to make this paper look like it has lived through the same misery as the person carrying it. You have to give it a history of being shoved into pockets, clutched in trembling hands, and forgotten on damp nights. You begin the mechanical stress phase. You don't just fold the paper, you break it. You roll the card between your palms, feeling the stiff fibers of the cardstock begin to yield. You're mimicking the natural wear of a wallet that doesn't exist. You create a spine in the paper, then gently fray the corners with a piece of pumice stone. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this level of detail today. You'd get impatient and try to age your phone bill by putting it in the microwave, which would just end with a fire and a very confused insurance adjuster. You'd be the only person in history to fail a forgery because you tried to speedrun a decade of wear and tear in 30 seconds. The mainstream historical fact is that the Gestapo and the Orpo Order Police were specifically trained to look for unnatural aging then symmetrical. To counter this, resistance forgers developed the pocket simulation. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the use of pocket lint. You keep a small jar of actual lint, hair, and dust collected from the bottom of old coats. You rub this debris into the folds of the forgery using a bit of animal fat or even a tiny smear of margarine. This creates a natural grime that sticks in the creases, making the document look authentically filthy. It's the kind of detail that smells like a human life, and to a distracted guard, smell is often more convincing than sight. Historians still argue whether the most effective aging technique was actually the vacuum method or the body heat approach. Some forgers would have their couriers sleep with the blank documents tucked against their skin for 3 nights before the ink was even applied. The natural oils and salt from human sweat would prime the paper, giving it a supple yellowish quality that was impossible to replicate with chemicals. You decide to use a more immediate tactic, the tea bath. You dip a soft rag into a cup of weak, lukewarm tea and dab the edges of the card. You aren't looking for a stain, you're looking for a toning. You want the white of the paper to shift toward the color of a bone that's been left in the sun. You take a common sewing needle and create a tiny, almost invisible tear near the thumb grip area. Everyone has that one document they've accidentally snagged on a button. This intentional imperfection is the hallmark of a master. You are building a narrative of clumsiness. You also take a very fine pencil and add a faint, illegible clerk's note in the margin, just a squiggle and a date from 3 months ago. It suggests the card has already passed through another official's hands. This is the social proof of forgery. If another official has supposedly seen it, the current guard is less likely to question it. You are using the laziness of the bureaucracy against itself. Remember the crocodile dung mindset. Here, it manifests as floor dusting. You drop the card on the basement floor and step on it. Not a stomp, just a firm, sliding pressure. This adds microscopic scratches and a layer of local grit. You pick it up and blow off the excess. Now, the document doesn't look like a product. It looks like a survivor. You feel a strange sense of satisfaction seeing your hard work ruined. In the world of the underground, the more you destroy the art, the more valuable the tool becomes. You are an anti-artist, a creator of the used and the discarded. A fringe technique you've heard about involves artificial sunlight. Since you're in a basement, you can't use the sun, but you use the heat from your tallow candle to flash-dry the tea stains, which creates a brittle, oxidized ring at the edges. You have to be incredibly careful. 1 second too long, and the paper browns, or worse, catches fire. You're playing with the very element that provides your light. You see the paper curl slightly under the heat, mimicking the way a document warps when it's been left in a humid kitchen. It's a delicate, dangerous dance. You look at the completed, aged Ken card. It's a masterpiece of the mundane. It looks tired. It looks like it has been through 3 checkpoints and a rainy night in a hayloft. You feel a pang of sympathy for the paper itself, a physical lie that has to carry the weight of a physical truth. You realize that aging a document is actually an act of empathy. You have to imagine the struggle of the person who will carry it and imbue the paper with that struggle. You aren't just changing the color, you're changing the vibe. The courier is ready. You hand over the card, and this time, it doesn't look like it just came from a forger's bench. It looks like it was pulled from a pocket. She nods, noticing the grime in the creases. This is the ultimate compliment in your line of work, that your work looks like it was never done at all. You watch her disappear into the shadows of the stairwell, the aged document tucked away. You turn back to your table. there's a fresh stack of white crisp paper waiting for its history to be written. You pick up the tea rag and the pumice stone, ready to manufacture a few more years of struggle. While your hands have perfected the aged texture of the paper, you know that the document is only half of the forgery. The other half is the person holding it. You are now standing mentally at the psychology of the checkpoint. In the resistance, we call this the performance. You can have the most perfect stamped Ken card in the world. But if your pupils are dilated with terror or your voice cracks when you state your fake name, the paper becomes a confession rather than a shield. You have to coach the people you're saving. You tell them, the guard isn't looking for a fake ID, he's looking for a fake person. You realize that the checkpoint is a theater of the absurd where the price of a bad review is a firing squad. Honestly, most of us can't even handle a performance review at work without getting a stomachache, so trying to act like a bored dairy farmer while a man with a Totenkopf on his cap stares into your soul is a level of method acting that would put Hollywood to shame. You'd probably forget your own fake birthday and try to Google it in your head. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this psychological game is the stress response training provided by partisan units. They would often hold mock interrogations in the middle of the night, screaming at couriers to wake them up and demanding their fake identities. If you couldn't answer while half asleep and disoriented, you weren't ready for the street. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the use of physical anchors. Some forgers would tell couriers to put a sharp pebble in their shoe. Why? Because the constant dull pain of the pebble gave them a real reason to look annoyed and pained, which masked the fake anxiety of the forgery. It gave them a physical sensation to focus on, preventing their minds from spiraling into what-if scenarios. It's the ultimate life hack for the high-stakes world of 1940s occupied Europe. Historians still argue whether the arrogance of the bureaucrat was the forger's greatest ally. There is a theory that German officials were so convinced of the superiority of their system that they physically could unbelieve a subhuman in a basement could replicate their sacred seals. You use this to your advantage. You teach your people the art of the subtle annoyance. If a guard stops you, don't be too helpful. Be a little bit frustrated that you're being delayed. Look at your watch. Sigh. If you act like the document is a boring necessity of a life you lead a busy living, the guard is more likely to treat it as such. You're weaponizing apathy. You look at the man sitting across from you in the basement, a middle-aged tailor who needs to get to the countryside. You hand him his new identity. You aren't Isaac anymore, you say softly. You are Piotr. You hate the rain. You have a bad hip, and you're worried about your sister's cow. You watch him repeat the details. His eyes are darting. You take the aged document and show him the slight tea stain you added. Remember, you tell him, this stain happened when you were at the cafe in Grodno. If he asks why it's dirty, tell him the waiter was a clumsy idiot. By giving the document a story, you give the holder a sense of ownership over the lie. Remember the crocodile dung philosophy of using the visceral to distract? In the psychology of the checkpoint, this often meant using smell memory. We would sometimes rub the documents with raw onion or cheap tobacco. Why? Because when the guard opens the card, he gets a faceful of peasant life. It's an olfactory confirmation of the visual lie. It's hard to stay suspicious of a document that smells exactly like the person holding it, tired, pungent, and decidedly unrevolutionary. You're creating a 360-degree sensory experience of nothing to see here. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used when discussing these survivors is the cognitive load of the lie. Some psychologists argue that the human brain can only maintain a certain number of false details before it glitches. This is why you keep the forgeries simple. You don't give people elaborate backstories. You give them one solid, boring truth to cling to. You tell the tailor to think about his actual sewing while he talks to the guard. The truth of his craft will provide the vibe of honesty, even if the name on the paper is a stamped fiction. You're an architect of the mind as much as a carver of starch. The basement feels even smaller as you run through these drills. You hear a truck pass by outside, and the tailor flinches. You realize that you can't forge courage. You can only forge the appearance of it. You give him a small, battered suitcase to carry. It's empty, but it gives him something to do with his hands. Hands are the biggest giveaway. If they're empty, they shake. If they're holding a handle, they have a job. You're managing the human ergonomics of the resistance. You think about the internal toll this takes. To survive, these people have to kill a part of themselves and replace it with a German-prived phantom. You are the one who provides the mask, but they are the ones who have to wear it until it feels like skin. You watch the tailor stand up, his suitcase in hand, his aged card in his pocket. He looks older, more tired, perfect. He looks like a man who just wants to get home. As he walks toward the stairs, you realize that your work isn't done when the ink dries. It's only done when that man passes the final gate and forgets that Piotr ever existed. You pick up the next blank card, the weight of the next performance already settling on your shoulders. The individual walk of a courier is a feat of personal bravery, but behind that single person lies the sprawling, invisible architecture of the sixth column. You are no longer just a craftsman or a coach. You are a dispatcher in a phantom logistics firm. In the Resistance, we realized early on that a document produced in a Minsk basement is useless if it needs to be in the hands of a family in a village 60 miles away. You navigate the complex web of safe houses and dead drops that form the circulatory system of the underground. This isn't a modern delivery service with GPS tracking and out-for-delivery notifications. This is a world of chalk marks on brick walls, specific flower pots moved 6 inches to the left, and coded messages tucked into the hollowed-out heels of boots. You are the one who ensures the product here photo-stamped masterpieces, the consumer without a single physical meeting between the two. The mainstream historical fact regarding these networks is that the Jewish partisan groups often collaborated with the Polish Home Army or Soviet partisans to maintain corridors of transit. These were routes through the city and countryside, where every third house was a sympathizer capable of hiding a courier or passing a package. A quirky, fringe tidbit about these dead drops is the use of edible signals. If a drop was compromised, the contact person would leave a specific item in their window, like a single, burnt crust of bread, to signify danger. Do not approach. If the drop was clear, they might leave a fresh apple. You're essentially running a high-stakes scavenger hunt, where the prize is not being executed by the Gestapo. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this. You can't even find your car keys in the morning, let alone a specific loose brick in a bombed-out alleyway in the middle of a blackout. Historians still argue whether the compartmentalization of these cells where you only knew the person directly above and below you was their greatest protection or their most frustrating bottleneck. It meant that if you were captured, you couldn't give up the whole network. But it also meant that if a single link in the chain disappeared, the whole shipment of identities could be lost in a vacuum. You sit at your table, writing out a delivery schedule in a code that looks like a laundry list. 3 shirts to be washed means 3 passports heading to the textile district. The starch is ready means the potato stamps have been applied. You're a poet of the mundane, turning the domestic into the tactical. You think about the dead drops themselves. One of the most common was the public library method. You'd tuck a forged work permit inside the pages of a specific, boring book, usually something like a 19th century agricultural manual that no one in their right mind would ever borrow. The recipient would come in an hour later, browse the same shelf, and walk out with a new life. It's a quiet, intellectual form of smuggling. You remember the crocodile dung lesson of using the ignored and the repulsive. Some drops were even located inside the pipes of communal outhouses. Why? Because no guard in his polished boots wanted to go digging around in a latrine to look for paperwork. You're utilizing the physical and social revulsion of the enemy as a protective shield. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used here is the asymmetric information war. The Resistance didn't have the numbers, but they had the local knowledge. You know which floorboard in the bakery creaks, which guard at the rail yard can be bribed with a tin of sardines, and which alleyway leads to a dead end. You are mapping the city not by its streets, but by its weaknesses. You realize that your basement is just one node in a vast, flickering grid of defiance. Every time you finish a document, you feel like you're dropping a pebble into a pond, watching the ripples move out through the safe houses, over the fences, and into the woods. The logistics also involve the recycling of materials. You don't just send out documents, you receive the scraps of failed missions. A blood-stained coat might come back, and your job is to salvage the ID from the pocket, clean it with your lactic acid, and prepare it for someone else. It's a grim, circular economy. You think about the ratlins that would eventually form the routes that helped. Survivors escape across borders after the camps were liberated. You are laying the groundwork for those future escapes right now, one starch-stained delivery at a time. You look at the clock. The next courier, a man disguised as a chimney sweep, is due in 10 minutes. You have to pack the merchandise. You don't put them in an envelope. That's too obvious. You wrap them in a greasy piece of newspaper used to hold salted herring. The smell is overpowering, which is exactly the point. If a guard stops the sweep, he'll see a dirty man with a smelly lunch and hopefully won't look any closer. You are a master of the unappealing package. You realize that in the world of logistics, the best camouflage is a lack of dignity. The sweep arrives, a shadow against the basement door. No words are exchanged. You hand him the lunch, and he nods. He's the next link in the chain. You watch him go, knowing that the documents you just spent 12 hours perfecting are now in the hands of the sixth column. You feel a strange sense of emptiness once the room is quiet again. The logistics of the underground are a constant cycle of creation and release. You are the source of the river, but you never get to see the sea. You just pick up the next potato and wait for the next laundry list to arrive. The logistical chain is only as strong as the physical integrity of your tools, and tonight, you learn the high price of a starch mistake. You are hunched over your table, the air in the basement unusually dry due to a sudden cold snap that has sucked the moisture from the stone walls. You reach for the potato stamp you carved just 2 hours ago, the one for the agricultural exemption. Certificate tanned, your heart sinks. The edges of the eagle's wings, once sharp and proud, have begun to shrivel. This is the dehydration trap. A potato is a living organism, even when sliced, and as it loses water to the dry air, the cells collapse unevenly. The intricate lines of the swastika have warped into a jagged, unrecognizable mess, and the O in Bavol McTeagued has shrunk into a solid, unclogged dot. You realize with a jolt of adrenaline that you already stamped 3 documents with this failing tool. You pull them back under the candle flame. The signatures look blurry, not with the human fatigue you were aiming for, but with a mechanical falseness that screams amateur. This is the nightmare scenario. If these papers make it to the checkpoint, the guard won't just see a typo, he'll see the evidence of a vegetable-based fraud. Honestly, most of us lose our minds when a Wi-Fi signal drops for 10 seconds, facing a life-or-death crisis, because a root vegetable decided to evaporate is a level of absurdity that would break a modern brain. You'd probably try to refresh the potato with a splash of water, only to realize you've turned it into a soggy, useless sponge. The mainstream historical fact here is that the shelf life of a vegetable, forgery was the biggest operational hurdle for the resistance. Unlike rubber or metal stamps, which could be hidden for months, a potato stamp had to be carved, used, and destroyed within a 6-to-8 window. This meant forgers lived in a state of permanent crunch time, a quirky, fringe tidbit. Some desperate forgers tried to seal their potato stamps with a thin layer of shellac or egg white to slow down the dehydration. While it worked for an hour or two, the chemical reaction between the ink and the sealant often created a cracking effect on the paper that looked like a spiderweb. You're fighting a losing battle against entropy. Historians still argue whether the transition from potatoes to more permanent materials like linoleum or lead was driven by the need for better quality, or simply the psychological exhaustion of having to recarve the same seals every single night. You feel that exhaustion now in the marrow of your bones. You take a knife and slice a fresh potato, the pop of the blade through the skin sounding like a tiny execution. You have to start over. The family scheduled for the 4 a.m. transport doesn't have time for your starch mistake. Every minute you spend recarving the eagle is a minute they spend sitting on their suitcases, listening for the sound of a truck. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the gross to save the great. You heard of a forger in Warsaw who used to keep his carved potatoes in a jar of urine. The salts and moisture allegedly kept the tuber firm for days, though the smell was a secondary danger. You aren't that desperate yet, but you do take a damp rag and wrap it around your extra potatoes, trying to create a microclimate of humidity in your workspace. You're a gardener of the apocalypse, tending to your crop of lies. The price of this mistake is also a waste of ink. Your walnutandrin reduction is labor-intensive to produce, and you've just wasted a precious tablespoon of it on documents that are now fit only for the furnace. You have to burn the evidence. You toss the 3 warped documents into the small stove in the corner. You watch the agricultural exemption curl and blacken, the forged eagle vanishing into ash. It's a sobering reminder that in your line of work, there is no undo button. There is only burn and begin again. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the materiality of resistance. It suggests that the very substances used, the potatoes, the soot, the scraps, dictated the pace of the war. You are beholden to the biology of the night. You begin to carve the replacement stamp. Your movements faster now, fueled by a panicked precision. You don't aim for perfection. You aim for passable. You realize that the starch mistake has cost you more than just time. It has cost you a piece of your confidence. You find yourself second-guessing the depth of every cut. Is it too shallow? Will it clog? As you finish the new stamp, you test it on a scrap. It's crisp, it's fresh. You apply it to the new blank document with a hand that is slightly too heavy, leaving a bold, dark mark. You blow on the ink, the sound of your breath, the only thing filling the silent room. The document is done, but the sun is dangerously close to the horizon. You hand the papers to the waiting courier, who has been standing in the shadows like a statue of judgment. The first ones were bad, you mutter. He doesn't care about your process. He only cares about the result. He takes the papers and vanishes. You sit back, staring at the shriveled original potato stamp on the table. It looks pathetic now, a tiny, wrinkled prune that almost killed a family. You pick it up and throw it into the fire, watching the starch hiss as it hits the coals. As you pack away the shriveled remains of your latest failure, the basement door creaks open to admit a new figure, a young woman in a modest floral dress, carrying a wicker basket filled with laundry. This is the invisibility of the ordinary in its most potent form. While the world focuses on the men with the guns, you recognize the female couriers as the true backbone of your operation. In the resistance, we call them the lifelines. You realize that gender biases are among your most effective tools. German guards raised on a strict diet of Kinderküche children, kitchen church, rarely suspect a young woman with a pleasant smile and a heavy load of washing of carrying high-level state forgeries. You take the papers you just finished and tuck them into a false bottom beneath the damp linens. You're entrusting these lives to the invisibility of the ordinary. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this role. You'd get flustered by a compliment or accidentally drop the laundry only for a dozen forged passports to spill out like a deck of cards. You'd be the only spy caught because you couldn't handle a simple "Good morning, Fräulein." The mainstream historical fact that underscores this is that women like Nayuta Bohm, known as Little Wanda, or the famous Wittke Kempner, could move through the city with far more freedom than Jewish men, whose identities were often checked physically in much more invasive and brutal ways. Women were the ones who could pass as non-Jewish more easily by changing their hair or wearing a crucifix. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the diaper defense. Couriers would sometimes wrap the forged documents in a soiled baby diaper at the bottom of a bag. No guard, regardless of how thorough he wanted to be, was going to stick his hand into a pile of dirty infant laundry to check for watermarks. It's a brilliant, if disgusting, use of social taboo. You're essentially using human nature's revulsion toward mess to protect the most pristine lies. Historians still argue whether the courier girls, the kashariyot, were the single most important factor in the survival of the Jewish resistance. Without them, the ghettos would have been isolated islands. With them, they were a connected network. You watch your courier adjust her scarf. She's not just a messenger, she's an actress. She has to maintain a flirtatious, slightly dim-witted persona when dealing with the green police. It's a grueling mental drain. You hand her a small piece of chocolateau, rare luxury, to keep her energy up. Eat it before the gate, you advise. A little sugar can stop the hand from shaking when the guard reaches for the basket. You recall the crocodile dung lesson once, more finding the utility in the overlooked. In this section of the story, the ignored element is the feminine experience. You've coached her to use feminine distractions. If a guard gets too close to the false bottom of the basket, she's instructed to burst into tears about a lost lover, or start a long, rambling story about a sick relative. Most men, especially those in uniform, find a woman's emotional outburst incredibly uncomfortable and will do anything to end the encounter quickly. You are weaponizing the patriarchy's own discomfort with female emotion to move your potato stamps across the city. It's a cynical but necessary strategy. A fringe, scholarly debate phrase that often pops up is the gendered subversion of space. It's a fancy way of saying that women could go where men couldn't, turning a grocery line or a park bench into a tactical meeting point. You see the city map in your head, not as a grid of streets, but as a series of safe zones defined by where a woman can stand without attracting notice. You are a choreographer of the mundane. You check the documents one last time. The aged look you perfected earlier is vital here. If she's doing the laundry for a wealthy family, she wouldn't have brand new identification. She needs the lived-in card that suggests she's been in the city for years. The basement feels lighter when she's there, a brief intrusion of the outside world's color. But the danger is just as sharp. You'll remind her of the 24-hour rule if she hasn't returned by dawn. The safe house is compromised, and you move the workshop. You live in a state of constant, low-grade mourning for the people who walk out that door and never come back. You realize that your potato stamps are just paper. She is the one who breathes life into them. She is the delivery system for hope, and the system is incredibly fragile. As she prepares to leave, you notice she's tucked a small sprig of dried lavender into the laundry. For the smell, she says with a wink, it's another fringe tidbit of the trade using a pleasant scent to mask the chemical temps of your walnut ink. You watch her climb the stairs, the wicker basket balanced on her hip. She looks like any other girl trying to earn a few marks in a hard city. The door closes, and the silence of the basement rushes back in, heavier than before. You turn back to the table, where a new set of blanks is waiting. You pick up the needle, thinking about the thousands of women walking through the gates of Europe right now, carrying the weight of the resistance in their laundry baskets and the future of a people in their pockets. While you've been focusing on the ink and the stamps, you eventually hit a wall that no amount of kitchen chemistry can bypass. The paper itself, you are currently staring at a stack of generic cardstock that, frankly, wouldn't fool a blind man at a midnight checkpoint. Real German documents use specific watermarked paper with security fibers, those tiny red and blue threads that look like microscopic veins. You realize that to move to the next level of forgery, you need the real deal. This brings you to the paper mills of the resistance. You aren't making the paper, you're stealing it. You are coordinating with a cell of Jewish partisans who have infiltrated a local printing house in Minsk that produces forms for the Generalkommissariat. This is a high-stakes heist where the loot isn't gold or jewels, but reams of blank, watermarked 80-gram bond paper. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a heist. You'd be the person who accidentally trips the alarm because you were trying to quietly open a bag of chips. You'd be caught holding a stack of paper and a Hefetan sandwich, which is not the heroic look we're going for. The mainstream historical fact here is that the resistance didn't just forge from scratch, they actively sabotaged and pilfered from the German supply chain. One of the most famous raids involved a group of partisans in the Warsaw Ghetto who managed to steal thousands of blank labor cards from a German truck. This allowed forgers to use authentic materials, making the potato stamp the only fake part of the document. A quirky, fringe tidbit involves the counter-water marking technique. If you couldn't get the real paper, you would take 2 thin sheets of paper. Draw the watermark on one with a mixture of oil and white wax, and then glue them together with a transparent adhesive. When held up to the light, the oil shadow looked exactly like a physical watermark. You're essentially building a 1940s layer cake of deception. Historians still argue whether the Germans ever suspected that their own paper mills were the primary source of the resistance's success. There are reports of missing batches of paper being blamed on Allied bombing raids or clerical errors, when in reality, the paper was already being sliced into passport-sized pieces in a cellar 3 streets away. You are the beneficiary of this bureaucratic chaos. You receive a package wrapped in heavy brown paper. Inside is the Holy Grail. Genuine, cream-colored paper with the faint, repeating watermark of the Reich's eagle. You run your fingers over it, it feels different. It has a snap to it, a crispness that your homemade cardstock lacked. This is the difference between a toy and a tool. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the environment to hide the extraordinary. In this case, you hide the stolen paper inside the covers of legitimate German books. You'll receive a copy of Mein Kampf or a collection of Goethe's poetry, but when you carefully steam open the spine, you find a dozen sheets of high-security paper hidden in the binding. It's a literal library of liberation. You have to be careful when handling it. Human skin oils can damage the finish of high-grade paper, making the ink run differently. You've started wearing thin cotton gloves, which makes you feel like a high-end jeweler. Even though you're working in a room that smells like wet dog and old potatoes, a fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the material authenticity gap. It describes the moment a guard feels a document and instinctively knows if it's right. Paper has a hand-specific weight and texture. By using the real paper, you've eliminated the guard's most dangerous sense, touch. Now, your potato stamp is the only thing that needs to pass scrutiny. You feel a surge of confidence. With this paper, your forgeries aren't just good enough. They are technically semi-authentic. You are blurring the lines between the state and the underground. You think about the risk the paper raiders took to get this to you. Every sheet represents a person who could have been shot if they were searched at the factory gate. You don't waste a single square inch. You plan your cuts like a diamond cutter, trying to get as many Ken carton as possible out of a single sheet. You use a heavy steel ruler and a fresh razor blade. The sound of the blade slicing through the high-quality paper is a clean, sharp shick, the sound of a professional at work. You are no longer just a hobbyist in a basement. You are a technician of the resistance. As you prepare to stamp the first sheet of real paper, you realize the pressure is higher now. If you mess up a potato stamp on scrap paper, you just throw it away. If you mess up on this paper, you've wasted a life-saving resource that can't be easily replaced. Your hands, which were steady 5 minutes ago, start to prickle with sweat. You wipe them on your trousers and take a deep breath. You align the potato eagle. You think about the paper mills and the people who risked everything to give you this blank canvas. You press down. The result is breathtaking. On the authentic paper, the walnut ink and the potato seal look indistinguishable from a document issued in a government office. The bleed is perfect. The watermark sits proudly behind the ink, a silent witness to the truth of your lie. You realize that with these materials, you aren't just saving lives. You're insulting the very regime that produced the paper. You're using their own industry to dismantle their ideology. You set the document aside and reach for the next sheet of the Holy Grail. The night is still young, and you have enough paper to save a small village. The paper feels like a victory, but as you move to fill in the specific biographical data of your latest client, you realize that handwriting alone won't suffice for every document. Some require the mechanical, cold authority of a typewriter. This is where you encounter the fingerprint of the keys. You are now sitting before a battered Continental typewriter, a machine that, in 1940s Europe, is more of a liability than a tool. You realize that a typewriter isn't a neutral instrument, it's a forensic witness. Every machine has a soul composed of its unique defects, a slightly bent E that sits a fraction of a millimeter too high, a chipped serif on the T, or a ribbon that strikes harder on the left than the right. If the Gestapo finds a document typed on this machine, they can trace it back to this basement as surely as if you de-left your DNA on the page. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this level of scrutiny. You can't even remember to clear your browser history. And here you are trying to manage the forensic signature of a Teuton mechanical beast. You'd probably get the Q and W keys jammed in the first 5 minutes and end up calling tech support that doesn't exist. The mainstream historical fact regarding typewriter forensics is that the German Sicherheitspolizei maintained an extensive database of typewriter samples from every occupied city. They knew which machines belonged to which municipal offices. To counter this, resistance forgers had to engage in typewriter musical chairs. A quirky fringe tidbit, forgers would often take the type bars, the little metal arms that hold the letters from 3 or 4 different machines, and swap them around. By creating a Frankenstein typewriter, you made it impossible for the authorities to match the document to any single registered machine. You're essentially scrambling the analog code of the state. Historians still argue whether the alignment error was the forger's greatest fear or their most useful trick. Some master forgers would intentionally bend a specific letter on their machines to match the known defects of a typewriter in a specific government office, such as the Warsaw Labor Bureau. You're currently looking at a work permit that needs to look like it came from the Minsk Railway Administration. You take a pair of needle-nose pliers and, with a heart-stopping amount of delicacy, you slightly nudge the S key on your machine. You aren't just typing, you're ghostwriting the errors of a specific real-world clerk. It's a level of detail that borders on the obsessive. You recall the crocodile dung principle of using the discarded to deceive. In this section, it's the typewriter ribbon. A brand new dark black ribbon is a disaster. It looks like a forgery. You need a ribbon that is tired. You've found that if you take an old dreed-out ribbon and soak it in a mixture of light machine oil and a tiny bit of your walnut ink, it produces a faint, uneven gray-black strike. This mimics the look of a machine that has been used to type 10,000 boring permits. You're aiming for the bureaucratic aesthetic of exhaustion. You want the guard to look at the text and see the boredom of the clerk who who allegedly typed it. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the mechanical individuality of resistance. It posits that the forgers didn't just fight with ideas, but with the specific physics of the machines they captured. You feel the weight of the keys under your fingers. Each clack feels like a hammer striking an anvil in the silence of the basement. You have to type with a staccato rhythm, fast and slightly uneven. If you type too slowly, the ink pools in the paper fibers, creating a perfect look that is instantly suspicious. You have to channel the energy of a man who has 50 people in line and just wants to go to lunch. You also have to worry about the ghosting of the ribbon. If you type the same name twice on 2 different documents, the ribbon might leave a microscopic pattern that links them. UV learned to advance the ribbon manually after every few words to ensure no 2 strikes are identical. It's a tedious finger staining process that makes your joints ache. You look at your hands, they are a map of ink, oil, and starch. You realize that you are becoming a part of the machine itself. You are the CPU of this 1940s computer, processing human lives into data that the Reich will accept. As you finish the last line of the permit, you notice a smudge on the letter M. Your heart skips. Is it a mistake? No, you realize it's perfect. It looks like the ribbon snagged for a millisecond, exactly as it would on a real, overworked office machine. You feel a strange sense of relief. In the world of forgery, a perfect mistake is the highest form of success. You pull the paper from the roller, the zip of the paper sounding like a tiny cheer. You check the alignment against a genuine sample. It's a match. The fingerprint of your machine now mirrors the fingerprint of the state. You set the permit aside and reach for the pliers again. For the next document, you need to unbend the S and perhaps tilt the R. The Frankenstein machine is ready for its next persona. You realize that while the potato stamp provides the seal, the typewriter provides the narrative. Together, they create a story so convincing that the reader, the guard at the gate, won't even realize they're rereading a work of fiction. You pick up the next blank sheet of watermarked paper, the mechanical soul of the resistance, ready to click-clack another life into safety. The urban basement has served you well, but as the heat of the occupation intensifies and the great action sweeps through the city, the urban forge becomes a death trap. You have to move. You are now transitioning from the damp stone of Minsk to the dense primeval canopy of the Nalebuki forest. You are joining the Lions of Judah, the Bielski partisans and other Jewish units who have turned the wilderness into a hidden city. Here, the history's hidden stories take on a wild green hue. Your workbench is no longer a rickety table, but a flat stump of a felled oak. Your light is no longer a tallow candle, but the dappled, filtered sunlight that manages to pierce through the thick pines. You realize that forging in the woods is a different beast entirely. The humidity is higher, the insects are relentless, and the official atmosphere of a city office feels 1,000 miles away. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the first night. You'd spend the whole time complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi and the organic mosquitoes, only to realize your tactical camouflage is just a bright neon windbreaker. You'd be the only partisan caught because you tried to glamp in a war zone. The mainstream historical fact about these forest shtetls is that they were incredibly sophisticated. The Bielski camp, for example, had a mill, a bakery, a theater, and of course, a fully functioning administrative office where you now reside. You are the forest's master of bureaucracy. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the use of forest materials to supplement your kit. When you ran out of standard ink thickeners in the woods, you discovered that the resin from a large tree, when boiled and filtered, creates a sticky, glossy medium that makes your potato stamps look almost like they were embossed. You're using the forest's own blood to create the Reich's seals. It's a literal merging of the partisan and the landscape. Historians still argue whether the documents forged in the forest were actually more convincing than those made in the city. Some suggest that because the partisans had more breathing room away from the constant threat of a Gestapo raid, they could take more time with the artistic details. However, others point out that the lack of precision tools made every document a gamble. You recurrently carving a stamp into a parsnip because potatoes are for eating when the supply lines are cut, and a firm parsnip can hold a line almost as well. You're adapting to the partisan diet of materials. You are a survivalist of the stationary world. You recall the crocodile dung lesson, using the repulsive to hide the precious. In the forest, this means your office is hidden inside a Zemlyan Khan, underground bunker dug into the earth and covered with logs and moss. To a German spotter plane or a patrol, it looks like a natural mound of dirt, but inside, it smells like your boiled larch resin and the sharp tang of the acids you brought from the city. You're living in a burrow of lies. You've learned to use the natural camouflage of the forest to protect the bureaucratic camouflage of the paper. A fringe scholarly debate phrase used to describe this period is the ecological resistance. It's the idea that the partisans didn't just hide in the woods, they weaponized the woods. You used the shadows of the pines to hide the shimmer of your eyelets. You used the sound of the wind in the branches to mask the click-clack of your Continental typewriter, which was carried 30 miles through the marsh on a man's back. Every piece of equipment in this bunker is a miracle of logistics and human endurance. You treat the typewriter like a holy relic, cleaning the pine needles out of the keys with a fine squirrel hair brush. You think about the lines of Judah around you. These aren't just soldiers, they are families' grandmothers, children, cobblers. They need papers for the eventual liberation, or for the scouts who must re-enter the civilized world of the occupied towns to trade for salt and medicine. You are the one who gives them a surface identity that allows them to move between worlds. You are the ferryman between the wild and the regulated. You look at your hands, which are now stained with both forest soil and purple ink. The line between the two has blurred. As you work, a partisan scout brings you a trophy, a genuine German military pass, taken from a captured patrol. This is gold. You don't just copy it, you dissect it. You notice the way the humidity of the forest has affected the original ink, causing it to feather slightly. You realize that if your forgeries are too crisp, they will look out of place in the woods. You have to forestage them. You take your finished parsnip stamp and apply it to the card, then you leave the card out in the damp night air for exactly 10 minutes. The paper absorbs just enough moisture to lose its city stiffness. It begins to look like something that has been carried through a swamp. You feel a strange sense of peace in the Zemlyanka. There is a rhythmic quality to the work here that the frantic city lacked. You are part of an ecosystem of defiance. You pick up a fresh parsnip and begin to carve the high command seal. The needle sinks into the root with a familiar pop. You think about how far you've come from that first potato in the Minsk basement. You are no longer just a forger. You are a builder of a shadow state. You are the administrative heart of the wilderness. As the sun sets and the forest turns a deep, bruised purple, you light a small oil lamp fueled by animal fat and keep carving. The lions of Judah are counting on your paper teeth to keep them safe. As you adjust to the rhythmic, damp life of the forest camp, the nature of your work shifts from general survival to a more targeted form of bureaucratic warfare. You are no longer just making people disappear into new names. You are making them essential. This is the era of the Arbeitskarta, work permits, the specific document that serves as a literal lifeline. In the eyes of the Reich, a person's right to breathe is directly proportional to their contribution to the war effort. You sit in your Zemlyanka, the earth walls pressing in, focusing on the specific essential stamps. Rüstungsbetriebe Armaments, Industry or Eisenbahndirektion Railway Directorate. If you can forge a document that places a person in a protected labor category, you can pull them back from the edge of the death camps. You are essentially hiring thousands of ghosts into a phantom workforce that exists only on the paper you produce. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the pressure of this HR department. You'd accidentally list a shoemaker as a nuclear physicist, and draw a level of scrutiny that would bring the whole forest down around your ears. You'd be the only forger to get a 1-star review on Yelp for improbable career placement. The mainstream historical fact regarding labor forgeries is that thousands of Jews survived the initial waves of deportations because they held yellow passes or work certificates indicating they were indispensable to German industry. Forgers in the underground focused on these documents because they were frequently updated and used a variety of localized stamps, making them easier to fake than the national Kenkart. A quirky, fringe tidbit involves the innocuous occupation strategy. Forgers often avoided labeling people as high-level engineers because those roles were too easy to verify. Instead, they made everyone master boiler technicians or advanced lathe operators, jobs that were critical enough to prevent deportation, but dull enough that a German inspector would never actually visit the workshop to check the expert's skills. You're building a shadow army of the mundane. Historians still argue whether the work permit strategy was a genuine act of salvation or a desperate delaying tactic that only bought a few months of life. However, in the business of survival, A month is an eternity. You are currently staring at a blank Arbeitskarte that needs a company seal from a munitions factory in Berlin. Since you're in the middle of a Belarusian forest, you don't have a catalog of Berlin factory logos. You have to rely on the fringe intelligence brought in by couriers, a torn corner of a pay stub, a blurry photograph of a factory ID, even a description of a logo seen on a crate of ammunition. You are a forensic reconstructor of corporate branding. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the ugly truth to hide the beautiful lie. In this case, you realize that official work permits are never clean. They are covered in the grease of the factory floor, the sweat of a long shift, and the coffee rings of a tired foreman. You take your forged permit and rub a bit of genuine rifle oil into the corner. The smell is sharp and mechanical. Then, you take a bit of soot from the camp's communal fire and smudge the edges of the company seal. You aren't just forging a document, you're forging the smell of labor. You want the guard to look at the card and practically hear the sound of the machines. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used when discussing these permits is the administrative sabotage. You aren't just saving the individual, you're cluttering the German logistics system with thousands of dead files. Every fake worker you create is a data point that slows down their efficiency. You feel a grim satisfaction in this paper clogging. You are the grit in the gears of the Reich's industrial machine. You pick up a needle and begin to carve the Inspector S initials into a small block of wood. Why wood? Because for these smaller, more repetitive stamps, the forest provides hard boxwood that, when seasoned by the fire, holds a sharper edge than a potato. You're evolving your tools as your business expands. The forest air is thick with the scent of pine and the distant metallic smell of a brewing storm. You look at the list of essential workers you need to create by dawn. There are 20 names. You think about the irony. You are employing these people so they don't have to work in the very camps that would kill them. It's a paradox of paper. You align the boxwood stamp. You've even carved a misaligned border into the stamp, mimicking the way a handheld stamp often strikes the paper at a slight angle. You are perfecting the human error of the system. As you work, a partisan soldier drops off a sample of a new German Documenta temporary travel authorization. You notice a tiny, almost invisible security feature, a specific number of perforations along the left edge. You realize you'll need to create a punch tool from a sharpened nail to replicate this. The war of the forger is a war of the microfeature. Every time they add a security measure, you find a force-based solution to bypass it. You feel like a hacker in a world of ink and wood. You're locked in a silent, high-stakes chess match with a bureaucrat in a distant office who doesn't even know you exist. You finish the first batch of boiler technicians. In the dim light of the Zemlyanka, they look perfect. They look like they've spent a decade in a factory in the Ruhr Valley. You set them aside to dry, the smell of rifle oil and soot filling the cramped space. You feel a sense of strange power, the power to redefine a human being as purpose in the eyes of the enemy. With a bit of wood and a smudge of grease, you've turned victims into assets. You pick up the next blank card, your boxwood stamp, ready to hire the next person on your list. The forest is quiet, but your factory is running at full capacity. The rhythmic clack of your typewriter and the steady shaving of wood are suddenly interrupted by a frantic knock at the Zemlyanka entrance. A courier, breathless and coated in the gray dust of a forced march, collapses into your workspace. There is no time for the usual formalities of the forest camp. A family of four, a tailor, his wife, and 2 daughters have been rounded up in a nearby village transit point. They are scheduled for deportation on the 4 a.m. transport tomorrow. It is currently midnight. This is the 2 4-hour deadline for a life, though in this case, you only have 4 hours. The product isn't just a single pass anymore. It's a complete set of identity papers, travel permits, and medical clearances that must look like they've been issued by 3 different municipal offices. If you fail, the next time they see the sun, it will be from the slats of a cattle car. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this kind of pressure. You get a panic attack when a food delivery is 5 minutes late. Trying to forge a multi-departmental bureaucracy in the time it takes to watch a movie is a level of high-stakes productivity that would cause a modern office worker to spontaneously combust. The mainstream historical fact about these emergency forgeries is that they were the most common cause of forger burnout. The physical strain of carving for distinct sets of seals, each requiring different regional codes and Fondsünder. A ticking clock led to permanent eye strain and hand tremors. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the wet and wet technique used in these crises. Normally, You'd let the walnut ink dry for hours to ensure it doesn't smudge. In a race against time, forgers would use a heated stone from the fire to iron the document dry in seconds. If the stone was too hot, it would char the paper. If it was too cool, the ink would smear into a purple blob the moment the courier touched it. You are playing a high-stakes game of bureaucratic hibachi. Historians still argue whether these last-minute forgeries were actually more successful because their hurried look mimicked the chaos of the German retreats and reorganizations. A perfectly crisp document might actually look too good for a transit point in the middle of a war zone. You decide to lean into the rushed clerk aesthetic. You don't aim for the perfect eagle. You aim for the eagle that looks like it was stamped by a man who had 1,000 more to do before his shift ended. You are forging the vibe of the deadline. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the messy reality to cover the desperate lie. In this section, that means using the blotter technique. You take a piece of raw wool and dab at the stamps while the ink is still slightly wet. This creates a texture of urgency. It suggests the documents were processed in a bustling, overworked office. You have to be a master of the authentic mistake. You intentionally tilt one of the stamps by 5 degrees. You make one signature slightly more illegible than the others. You are creating a symphony of official incompetence. A fringe scholarly debate phrase used here is the temporal sovereignty of the resistance. It's the idea that by outworking the enemy's timeline, you are effectively reclaiming time itself. You feel the seconds ticking in the pulse of your neck. You finish the first set of father's papers. Your hands are shaking now, not from fear, but from the sheer mechanical output. You take a sip of cold water and begin the mother's set. The 4-hour deadline is actually a series of 6 tie-scan sprints. You realize that you aren't just a forger. You are a biological printing press. You think about the family waiting in that village cellar. They don't know who you are. To them, you are a rumor, a ghost in the woods who can write miracles on paper. The weight of that expectation is heavier than the earth above your bunker. You focus on the youngest daughter's papers. She's only 6. For her, you choose a safe passage medical certificate. You use a different ink lighter, bluer shade, to suggest it came from a clinic. You are diversifying the lie to make it more robust. You're building a multi-layered shield of paper around a child. As the clock strikes 3 a.m., you are on the final document, the travel route authorization. This one is the most complex, requiring a series of transit stamps from towns along the way. You don't have time to carve new stamps for every town. You use the partial stamp, trick pressing only the edge of a generic circular seal, and then handle-turning the town names in a tiny, cramped script. It looks like a busy clerk didn't have room for the full stamp. It's a brilliant bit of visual shorthand that saves you 20 minutes of carving. You are an editor of the impossible. At 3:30 a.m., you hand the bundle of papers to the courier. They are still warm from the heated stone. The ink is set, the mistakes are convincing, and the aged texture is perfect. You watch the courier vanish into the pre-dawn mist of the forest, heading toward the village. You collapse onto your straw pallet, your eyes refusing to close. You've just finished a marathon of the soul. You don't know if they'll make it. You don't know if the guard will see through the partial stamp. All you know is that for the next few hours, that family has a chance to stay together because you knew how to work a heated stone and a boxwood seal. You lie there in the dark, the scent of walnut and iron still clinging to your skin, waiting for the sun to tell you if your deadline was met. The crisis of the midnight deadline passes, but it leaves you with a profound realization. The potato is a temperamental god. While the tuber saved the day in the early months, the increasing permanence of the forest camp allows you to evolve your craft. You are moving beyond potatoes into the world of rubber, wood, and linoleum. You sit at your oak stump bench, looking at a strip of linoleum flooring salvaged from a bombed-out schoolhouse. Unlike the potato, linoleum doesn't weep starch. It doesn't shrivel in the dry air of a winter bunker, and it doesn't rot. It is the industrial-grade evolution of the resistance forge. You feel like you've moved from the Stone Age to the Iron Age of forgery. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this transition. Carving linoleum requires a level of steady physical force that would have you accidentally gouging a hole in your thumb within 5 minutes. You'd be the only partisan needing a medic because you were beaten by a piece of kitchen flooring. The mainstream historical fact here is that as the resistance became more organized, they established central laboratories that moved away from perishable vegetables. These workshops used vulcanized rubber from tires or even carved lead from plumbing pipes to create stamps that could last for years. A quirky fringe tidbit: some forgers used the soles of liberated German boots. The high-quality rubber, used by the Wehrmacht, was perfect for holding fine detail. Imagine the satisfaction of carving a resistance travel pass into the very rubber that used to march for the Reich. It's a poetic reversal of utility, the enemy's footprint, becoming your path to freedom. Historians still argue whether the shift to permanent materials made the forgeries too consistent. A potato stamp's degradation actually mimicked the organic wear of real rubber stamps, which often had bits of lint or dried ink stuck in them. To combat the too perfect look of your new linoleum seals, you have to intentionally mar the surface. You take a file and create microscopic nicks in the border of the seal. You are now manufacturing wear and tear on a tool that is technically brand new. You are a curator of the artificial flaw. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the mundane to mask the lethal. In the forest, your new linoleum press is disguised as a simple cobbler's kit. If a patrol finds your bunker, they see awls, needles, and scraps of floor covering, things a poor man might use to patch his boots. They don't see the imperial ministry of the interior hiding on the underside of a rubber heel. You've learned that the best hiding place isn't behind a secret wall, but in plain sight, as a tool of a lower class. You are weaponizing the Germans' class-based disregard for peasant work. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the material durability of defiance. It's the idea that, as your tools became permanent, your resolve did as well. You no longer feel like a temporary ghost. You are a steady manufacturer of reality. You take a VH Tula luxury item smuggled in from a city art shop and press it into the linoleum. The material resists, then yields with a satisfying clean curl of plastic. You can achieve a level of detail here that was impossible with a potato. You can carve the tiny serif tails on the Gothic lettering of a Reichsbahn ticket. You can make the eagle's eyes look sharp and piercing. You think about the lions of Judah who are now carrying these permanent lies. These documents can survive a dunk in a river or a night in a damp pocket without the ink running into a purple blur. You are giving the partisans a durable identity. You realize that the evolution of your materials reflects the evolution of the war itself. The makeshift desperation of the ghetto has been replaced by the structured, cold-blooded efficiency of the forest. You aren't just reacting anymore. You are building a system. As you finish the linoleum stamp for the Eastern Railway Administration, you notice how the light catches the deep grooves. It looks like a piece of jewelry, a dark negative espis cameo of oppression. You take your new iron gull ink, which you've thickened with a bit of pine resin to give it a commercial sheen, and apply it to the stamp. The impression on the paper is startling. It is deep, crisp, and terrifyingly official. It lacks the softness of the potato, which means you have to work twice as hard on the distressing phase. You take a piece of sandpaper and lightly scuff the fresh ink. You're an artist who has to learn how to be a vandal. You set the linoleum block into a small wooden frame you built, creating a hand press that ensures even pressure every time. This is your Factory 2.0. You can now produce 50 identical high-quality passes in an hour. The scale of your impact has grown, but so has the risk. A potato could be eaten. A linoleum stamp is evidence. You keep a small bucket of acid near your bench. If the alarm sounds, your permanent tools will have to meet a very permanent end in a cloud of corrosive smoke. You pick up the next strip of flooring, the VGOS, ready to carve the next essential lie. As your workshop evolves from the ephemeral potato to the permanent linoleum, a different kind of weight begins to press down on you, an internal toll of the white lie. You are no longer just a technician. You are a gatekeeper, because the high-quality materials, like the stolen watermarked paper and the iron gull ink, are finite. You cannot save everyone. You sit in the flickering light of the Zemlyanka, staring at a list of names. Each name represents a life, but your supply chain only has enough authentic cardstock for 10 Kenkarten tonight. You have to decide who gets the gold standard forgery and who gets the budget version that might not survive a second glance. You are grappling with the moral weight of playing God, a role you never applied for and certainly weren't trained for. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this kind of ethical dilemma. You can't even decide what to watch on Netflix without a 20-minute internal debate. Being the person who decides which child gets the real paper and which gets the teastin scrap is a level of psychological pressure that would leave most modern people paralyzed. The mainstream historical fact here is that resistance forgers often faced agonizing triage decisions. Priority was frequently given to couriers and scouts, those whose work protected the entire community, leaving families or the elderly with lower-tier forgeries. This created a secret, heartbreaking hierarchy within the underground. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the placeholder strategy. To ease the guilt, some forgers would create low-grade documents that were intentionally designed to look like temporary permits, hoping the guard would simply issue a real one rather than arrest the holder. It was a gamble on the bureaucratic laziness of the enemy. You're essentially trying to design a path through a minefield using nothing but your intuition and a piece of starch. Historians still argue whether the guilt of the forger contributed to the high rates of post-war trauma among resistance members. You feel it in the way your hand hesitates over the paper. When you carve a name into a stamp, you aren't just writing letters, you're anointing a survivor. You recall the crocodile dung lesson. Sometimes you have to use the lesser material to protect the greater goal. In this case, the lesser material is your own peace of mind. You sacrifice your conscience so that others might have a future. You've started talking to the potatoes before you carve them, a fringe habit that makes the other partisans look at you sideways. You're imbuing the vegetables with the souls of the people they are meant to save. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the bioethics of the underground. It explores the impossible choices made when resources are scarce. You look at the name of an elderly man on your list. He's 70, a former clockmaker. Then you look at a young mother. You have one sheet of the Reich Eagle watermarked paper left. Your heart tells you to save the mother. But the logic of the resistance says the clockmaker has skills that could fix the unit's broken watches and tools. You are a clerk of the soul, tallying up human worth in the margins of a ledger. It's a cold, clinical necessity that feels like a betrayal of everything you're fighting for. You think about the lions of Judah outside your bunker. They see you as a magician, a man who turns grocery items into life. They don't see the pile of rejected documents in the corner, the ones that weren't quite good enough, the ones that represent lives you couldn't quite guarantee. You've become a perfectionist because any flaw feels like a personal failure, a crack in the armor you're building for your people. You realize that your white lies are the only thing keeping the black truth of the occupation at bay. As you finally press the stamp onto the last hidier document of the night, you feel a hollow sense of completion. You've made your choices. The ink is drying, the names are set, and the winners of tonight's triage have been decided. You take the remaining names, the ones who will receive the secondary documents, and you promise yourself you'll spend twice as much time on the aging process to make up for the lack of watermarked paper. You'll use more soot, more tea, more pocket lint to hide the truth. You are an architect of shadows, trying to build a mansion of safety out of the ruins of your own morality. You pick up the next scrap of paper, your eyes burning, ready to manufacture the next necessary deception. The moral weight of your choices is heavy, but the external world doesn't give you the luxury of wallowing. The enemy is evolving too. You are now entering the dangerous game of counterintelligence and the Ratlins. As the resistance grows more successful, the Gestapo and the Abwehr have caught on. They've begun deploying Wagner collaborators and double agents who specialize in spotting the subtle telltales of a basement forge. These specialists don't just look for a missing watermark, they look for the starch sheen. They know that a potato-based ink leaves a microscopic residue of glucose that reacts to certain chemical sprays. You sit in your Zemlyanka, realizing that your greatest tool has become your greatest liability. You are being hunted by people who know your craft as well as you do. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a run-in with a professional rat catcher. You'd try to act cool, but your face would twitch every time they mention the word tuber, and you'd probably accidentally offer them a forged potato as a snack. You'd be the only spy to out yourself because of a nervous habit of peeling the labels off of things. The mainstream historical fact regarding this spy versus spy era is that the Germans established the Forschungszentrale Forgery Central, a specialized unit dedicated to cataloging every known resistance forger's handwriting. They treated you like a serial killer, mapping your specific carving style across Europe. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the inverted trap. To catch a collaborator, forgers would sometimes intentionally include a specific trap error in a document, like a misspelled street name that didn't exist. If a partisan returned with news that the document had passed a checkpoint, you knew they were lying, because a real guard would have caught the fake street. You're using your own mistakes as a lie detector. Historians still argue whether the ratlins, the escape routes out of Europe, were more of a success for the refugees or a goldmine for the intelligence services, who used them to infiltrate the resistance. You have to be paranoid. You've started using double-blind forgery. You produce the stamp, but someone else in a different bunker applies the ink, and a third person ages it. This way, if one of you is caught, the Gestapo only gets a piece of the puzzle, never the whole picture. You are a fragmented ghost, scattered across the forest. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the repulsive to shield the vital. In the world of counterintelligence, this means the dirty document defense. You've heard of forgers who would intentionally rub a document with a tiny amount of dog feces or rotting meat before handing it to a courier. Why? Because the average German officer, obsessed with cleanliness and Aryan hygiene, would take one whiff, grimace, and wave the person through without touching the paper. You are literally weaponizing filth to protect the sanctity of the life you've forged. It's a gutturning but brilliant survival tactic. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the semiotic warfare of the underground. It's the idea that the war was won not just with bullets, but by controlling the symbols of authority. You look at your linoleum stamp, it's a perfect replica of a Reich seal. By making it so perfect, you've rendered the real seals meaningless. If a fake is indistinguishable from the truth, then the truth no longer has power. You are an anarchist of the archive, tearing down the regime's legitimacy one stamped page at a time. The forest is full of eyes now. You've had to move your bunker 3 times in the last month. Each time, you have to pack up the Frankenstein typewriter, the vials of walnut ink, and your precious Holy Grail paper. The ratlins are tightening, and the demand for papers is shifting from survival to escape. People want to get to Sweden, to Switzerland, to anywhere the eagle doesn't fly. You are forging foreign passports now: Swiss, Swedish, even South American. These are much harder. You have to learn the bureaucratic languages of countries you've never visited. You are a global traveler who has never left a 10-mile radius of a Belarusian forest. As you work on a Swedish laissez-passer, you realize that your starch-stained hands are a dead giveaway. You've started using a pumice stone to scrub your fingers until they bleed, trying to remove the permanent ink of your trade. You are literally trying to erase yourself. You look in a small cracked mirror. You don't recognize the person staring back. You see a forger, a liar, a lifesaver, and a ghost. You pick up the next blank card, the weight of the ratlins pressing in, ready to forge a path through a world that is quickly running out of hiding places. The claustrophobic tension of the ratlins reaches a fever pitch, but then the world begins to tilt on its axis. The distant rumble of artillery isn't just a background hum anymore. It's a rhythmic promise of change. You are living through the liberation of the forger's kit. As the German front lines crumble and the Great Retreat begins, your role in the forest Zemlyanka undergoes a frantic metamorphosis. The demand for papers hasn't decreased. It has simply changed direction. Suddenly, people don't need essential work permits to stay in the city. They need survivor certificates and transit visas to get as far away from the carnage as possible. You find yourself in a chaotic, liminal space where the old world's laws are dead, but the new world hasn't quite decided on the new ones. You are forging documents for the displaced person's DPs before the term has even become a household name. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the chaos of liberation. You'd be the person trying to organize a single file line while a column of tanks rolls through your living room. You'd be the only person caught in a revolution because you were too busy trying to find a matching set of eyelets. The mainstream historical fact here is that the period immediately following liberation was a bureaucratic vacuum. Forgers who had spent years hiding from the Nazis suddenly found themselves working openly or semi-openly to help survivors cross the new, shifting borders of Europe. Jewish partisan groups often confiscated abandoned German printing offices, turning the tools of the oppressor into the engines of the exodus. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the innocent Nazi forgeries. In a bizarre twist of fate, some resistance forgers were actually approached by former low-level German collaborators or ordinary soldiers who wanted forged anti-fascist credentials to avoid the coming Soviet purges. Historians still argue whether the forgers who accepted these commissions were pragmatists funding the Jewish flight to Palestine or traitors to their own cause. You, however, stick to your own. You are focusing on the Nansen-style provisional passes for those who have no home to return to. Historians still argue whether the chaos of the crossroads was the most dangerous time for a forger. With the Red Army moving in from the east and the Western Allies from the west, you are suddenly dealing with 3 or 4 different languages and bureaucratic styles at once. You have to learn the Cyrillic alphabet for your Soviet travel orders and the blocky utilitarian English of the American DP identity card. You've added a new set of chemicals to your bench, a crude bleach to strip the Nazi seals off of stolen stationery so you can replace them with the red star or the Allied star. You're recycling the war's debris into the Pieces Foundation. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the discarded to build the valued. In this era, you are using the abandoned uniforms of the fallen. You've found that the high-quality wool of a German officer's tunic can be boiled down to create a thick, pulpy paper substitute when mixed with wood glue. It's a literal reclothing of the truth. You are taking the fabric of the occupation and turning it into the paper of the liberation. You've also started using the captured rubber stamps of the local commander. You don't have to carve the eagle anymore. You just have to edit it. You take a razor and slice the swastika out of the center of the seal, leaving a hollow circle. It's a silent, physical act of denazification. A fringe scholarly debate phrase used to describe this time is the anarchy of the archive. It's the idea that for a few months, in 1944 and 1945, the paper world was more real than the physical world. If you had a paper that said you were a repatriated citizen of Poland, the Red Army would put you on a train. If you didn't, you were a stateless element to be detained. You are the one who decides who gets to go home, or what home even means. You are a cartographer of the heart, drawing borders on small pieces of cardstock. The forest camp is buzzing with a new, frantic energy. The lions of Judah are packing their gear, moving out of the Zemlyankas and back toward the charred remains of the towns. You look at your forger's kit. It's battered, stained, and smells of 5 different kinds of chemistry. You realize that this box of tricks has been your entire world for years. You feel a strange reluctance to leave the safety of the damp earth. In the woods, you were a king of the invisible state. In the liberated world, you will just be another refugee with ink-stained fingers. As you pack the last of your linoleum stamps, you find the original shriveled potato you used to practice the Reich Eagle months ago. It's a hard black pebble now. You don't throw it away. You put it in your Paquita, talisman of the humble root that started it all. You step out of the bunker and into the sunlight of a world that is no longer occupied but is far from whole. You have a stack of transit visas in your bag and 1,000 people waiting for your signature. The war of survival is over, but the journey of the displaced has just begun. You pick up your pen, the ink of liberation ready to flow. The dust of the liberation has settled into a gritty new reality, the post-war shadow. You are no longer hiding in a forest, but you aren't exactly free either. You are in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Munich, living in a repurposed barracks that still smells of the previous tenants. The war is officially over, but for the survivors, the battle for a destination has just begun. You realize that the history's hidden stories didn't end with the surrender. They simply moved into the world of the Nansen legacy. The world is a patchwork of closed borders, and you are once again the person who provides the seam. You are forging papers for the Brichitha, organized underground effort to help Jewish survivors reach mandatory Palestine. You sit at a makeshift desk, using a stolen UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration typewriter. Trying to replicate the complex Lion of Judah, seal of a British mandate passport. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this post-war bureaucracy. You'd get so fed up with the red tape that you'd accidentally tell a British officer exactly where he could shove his white paper policy. You'd be the only person to end up in a military stockade because you could unhandle the irony of being liberated by people who won't let you leave. The mainstream historical fact regarding the post-war forger is that their work was essential for the illegal immigration Aliyah bet. Thousands of survivors traveled across Europe using collective passports or individual forgeries that claimed they were Greek, Italian, or even Dutch anything to get them to the Mediterranean ports. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the innocent tourist forgery. Forgers would create travel documents that looked like they belonged to Red Cross workers or volunteer nurses by dressing survivors in liberated Allied uniforms and giving them these papers. They could move entire busloads of people across borders under the guise of medical repatriation. You're not just forging paper now, you're forging entire personas of international aid. Historians still argue whether the techniques perfected in the partisan basements the potato logic influenced the modern refugee documentation system. Some scholars point to the provisional identity card used in the late 1940s as having DNA that can be traced back to the resistance forges. You're currently working on a certificate of nationality from a non-existent consulate. You've discovered that the British are obsessed with a specific type of embossed seal. Since you don't have an embossing press, you've returned to your fringe roots. You use a blunt sewing needle to trace the seal from the back of the paper, creating raised tactile texture that mimics the look of a heavy-duty metal press. You're a sculptor of the backside, creating depth where there is only flat ink. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the mundane to hide the miraculous. In the DP camp, this means using the official rations. UVA found that the waxy paper used to wrap American chocolate bars can be used as a transfer sheet. If you draw a seal on the wax with a heavy ink and then press it onto a passport with a hot spoon, the heat melts the wax and transfers the ink with a commercial gloss that your forest larch resin could never achieve. You're a scientist of the snack bar, turning Hershey wrappers into high-security features. It's a bizarre, sweet form of sabotage. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used is the bureaucracy of the stateless. It describes the period when millions of people lived in a legal no man's land. You are the self-appointed registrar of this shadow nation. You feel a strange sense of continuity. The enemy has changed from the man in the black uniform to the man in the tan uniform. But the problem is the same. The paper doesn't match the person. You look at your hands, which are finally starting to heal from the chemical burns of the war years, only to be stained again by the blue ink of the British Mandate. You realize that you may never be clean of this work. You think about the Nansen legacy, the idea of a passport for those without a country. You are creating a provisional Nansen of your own. You are helping people leave the camps that were supposed to be their liberation. You see the irony in every document you produce. You are using the skills learned in a death-shadowed basement to build a bridge to a sun-drenched future in a land many of these survivors have only seen in prayer books. You are a bridge builder who works in ink and wax. As you finish the embossing on a Greek passport for a young man from D, you notice how tired you feel. This is a different kind of tired than the forest exhaustion. It's a bureaucratic fatigue. You've been living a lie for so long that the truth feels like a foreign language. You set the document aside and reach for the next Hershey wrapper. The Britcha truck leaves at dawn, and you have 10 more Greeks to manufacture before the sun comes up. You pick up your spoon and your needle, the post-war shadow lengthening around you, ready to forge one more path to the sea. As the dust of the post-war exodus begins to settle, a new heavy silence descends the silence of the master forgers. You find yourself in a small, quiet apartment, perhaps in Paris, Tel Aviv, or New York. The war is a decade behind you, then 2, then 3. The history's hidden stories are being written into textbooks, but your name is nowhere to be found. You realize that, for many of the greats, like Adolf Kaminsky, the end of the war wasn't the end of the work. It was simply the start of a deeper shade of anonymity. You are living the shadow legacy. You've traded the damp forest semlyanka for a clean kitchen table. But you still find yourself instinctively checking the bleed on your morning newspaper, or scrutinizing the watermark on a banknote. You are a person who knows too much about the fragility of truth to ever fully trust a piece of paper again. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the quiet life. You'd be that neighbor who gets arrested because the FBI thinks you a sleeper agent, but really you just have a very suspicious collection of vintage typewriters and a lifetime supply of potatoes in the cellar. The mainstream historical fact here is that many of the most prolific forgers of the Jewish resistance stayed in the shadows for decades. Adolf Kaminsky, for instance, continued to forge documents for decolonization movements in Algeria, anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, and draft dodgers during the Vietnam War without ever taking a single cent for his work. He kept his secret until the 2000s. A quirky fringe tidbit about this silent era is that many forgers found it impossible to return to normal. Art, if you spent your youth carving the seals of genocidal regimes to save lives, painting a bowl of fruit feels profoundly trivial. You've become an artist of the consequential, and the commercial world has nothing to offer you. You're a ghost, haunted by the people you saved, wondering if they ever realized their lives were built on a foundation of starch and nerve. Historians still argue whether this silence was a result of lingering trauma, a continued commitment to clandestine cells, or simply a professional habit of operational security that became a personality trait. You find that you can't even tell your own children the truth. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that their boring parent once held the power of life and death in a needle tip and a root vegetable? You've become a master of the omission. You are forging your own autobiography, erasing the ink of the war years to create a clean record for the next generation. You are your own final forgery. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy, using the hidden to protect the precious. In your civilian life, this means hiding your skills behind a mundane profession. Maybe you became a photographer, a printer, or a dry cleaner, jobs that explain the chemical smells on your clothes and the precision of your hands. You use the camouflaged life to protect the peace you helped win. You've found that the best way to keep a secret is to be so uninteresting that no one ever thinks to ask you a question. You've weaponized the boredom of the neighbor, just as you once weaponized the bureaucratic fatigue of the guard. A fringe scholarly debate phrase often used here is the ethical continuity of the underground. It suggests that, for people like you, the war never ended because injustice never ended. You look at your old forger's kit, tucked away in a trunk in the attic. The walnut ink has dried into a crusty black salt. The linoleum stamps are brittle, but the starch-stained hands feel the itch every time you read about a refugee crisis on the other side of the world. You realize that you aren't just a veteran, you are a sleeper cell of empathy. You are a person who knows that when the system fails, the potato provides. The silence is also a form of protection for those you saved. If the world knew that 10,000 legitimate citizens were actually the products of a Minsk basement, their lives might be called into question. By staying silent, you ensure that their forged reality remains the only reality. You are the ultimate ghostwriter, ensuring that your characters get to live out their stories without the author ever taking a bow. You feel a strange sense of peace in this erasure. To be forgotten is the final proof that your work was perfect. As you sit on your porch, watching the sun set on a world that seems to have forgotten the paper wars, you feel the weight of the shriveled potato in your pocket, the one you kept from the forest. It's a small, hard lump of history. You realize that you don't need a monument or a medal. You have the knowledge that somewhere, a grandson is being born to a man who, on paper, shouldn't have existed. That child is your living watermark. You set your tea down and look at your hands. The ink is gone, the scars have faded, but the precision of the heart remains. You are the master forger, and your greatest masterpiece is the silence of a life well lived. Decades later, the silence of the master forger is finally broken by the meticulous hands of the archivist. You find yourself standing in a sterile, climate-controlled vault within a modern museum, perhaps Yad Vashem in Jerusalem or the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. The earthy, organic smells of the forest Zemlyanka have been replaced by the neutral, scentless air of high-tech preservation. You are looking at a small display case where a single yellowed can cart rests under a specialized filtering glass. This is the preservation of the perishable artifact. You realize that the very things that saved lives, the starch, the walnut juice, the sugar-thickened ink, are now a nightmare for conservators. Organic materials like potatoes leave behind chemical signatures that can eventually eat the paper from the inside out. You are watching a battle between your past ingenuity and the slow crawl of time. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the museum life. You'd be constantly trying to fix the displays with a bit of tea and a needle, and the security guards would tackle you before you could even explain the concept of pocket-worn texture. You'd be the only person banned from a museum for unauthorized historical enhancement. The mainstream historical fact regarding these artifacts is that very few pototoast stamped documents actually survived the war. Because they were living tools of survival, most were destroyed once the holder reached safety to prevent any link back to the resistance cells. The few that remain are considered among the rarest and most fragile items in Holocaust collections. A quirky, fringe tidbit involves the microorganism debate among conservators. When a pototaste-stamped document arrives at a lab, scientists have to decide whether to neutralize the remaining starch particles or preserve them. If they remove the starch, they remove the evidence of the forgery's method. If they leave it, it might attract mold that destroys the entire archive. You are essentially a ghost whose DNA is causing a scientific crisis 50 years after you left the basement. Historians still argue whether the crude nature of these documents makes them more significant than the high-quality industrial forgeries produced by state-sponsored units like the British. So, there's a scholarly debate phrase, often used here, the artifact of agency. It suggests that a potato stamp is more than just a tool. It is a physical manifestation of a person reclaiming their right to exist using the most basic materials of the earth. You look at the document in the case and see the eagle you carved. Under the museum's powerful magnifying glass, the organic grain of the potato is visible, the tiny, cellular irregularities that no metal press could ever replicate. It's a thumbprint of defiance. You recall the crocodile dung philosophized, the use of the gross to protect the great. In the museum, this is reflected in the way they handle your work. The conservators wear white gloves, treating your dirty Sutan-Sugar creations as if they were the Dead Sea Scrolls. You find it darkly humorous. They are protecting the dirt you fought so hard to apply. You see the tea stains you made with a rag being analyzed by spectrometers to determine the exact brand of 1940s herbal infusion you used. Your accidental coffee rings have become intentional historical data points. You are a master of the mundane who has been elevated to the status of a relic maker. A fringe scholarly debate phrase that resonates in this quiet vault is the materiality of memory. It's the idea that we can only truly understand the past by touching the things that touched the people. You look at the aged texture of the carve frayed corners you rubbed with a pumice stone. The museum calls this physical evidence of displacement. You just called it not getting caught. There is a disconnect between the clinical language of the historian and the visceral, sweaty reality of the carver. You realize that while they can preserve the paper, they can never truly preserve the fear that gave the paper its value. The vault is filled with rows of flat, acid-free drawers. Each one contains hundreds of hidden stories. You realize that your work in the forest and the basement was part of a much larger global library of survival. You see forgeries from the French maquis, the Italian partisans, and the Dutch underground. Each one used a different local trick. Some used linoleum, some used carved rubber, but yours, the humble potato, remains the most human. It's a testament to the fact that when everything else is taken away, the earth itself provides the tools for rebellion. As you prepare to leave the museum, the curator thanks you for your contribution to history. You nod, but you don't tell them that you still have a shriveled black pebble of a potato in your pocket. You don't tell them that the real history isn't in the display case. It's in the bloodline of the people who walked past the guards because of those flawed starch seals. You step out into the bright, modern street, the hum of the city, a stark contrast to the silence of the vault. You feel a sense of closure. Your work has been documented, filed, and protected. The hidden stories are no longer hidden, but the precision of the heart that created them remains your own secret. You walk toward the subway, your ink-free fingers drumming a staccato rhythm on your bag, the same rhythm you once used on a Continental typewriter in a forest long ago. The long journey from the damp basement in Minsk to the sterile vaults of history finally draws to a close, bringing us to the legacy of the starch-stained hands. You stand now in the quiet of your own mind, looking back at the trail of vegetable peels, walnut shells, and forged lives you've left in your wake. You realize that the humble potato wasn't just a gimmick, it was the ultimate tool of democratic resistance, because it belonged to everyone. It was the 3D printer of the oppressed, a way to turn a calorie into a certificate of existence. You think about the hidden stories we've uncovered tonight, not the stories of generals and grand strategies, but the stories of the administrative partisans who fought a war with needles and ink. You've seen how a single, well-carved tuber could derail the most efficient killing machine in history by simply introducing a human error into the ledger. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the emotional come-down of this reflection. You'd be sitting there crying over a bag of potato chips, wondering if each one could have been a passport. You'd be the only person to give a eulogy at a grocery store. The mainstream historical fact that serves as our final anchor is the sheer scale of this paper resistance. It is estimated that thousands of individual forgers worked across Europe, and while their methods varied, their impact was unified. They created a shadow population that the Reich could never fully account for. A quirky fringe tidbit to carry with you is that some of the master forgers, even decades later, could never bring themselves to throw away a good potato. They would find themselves at the market, unconsciously testing the firmness of a Yukon Gold or a russet. Looking for that specific density that would hold the fine line of a travel authorization. It's a muscle memory of the soul, a permanent stain on the subconscious that outlasts any ink. Historians still argue whether the ingenuity of the desperate is a renewable resource or a specific byproduct of the 20th century's bureaucratic obsession. But as you look at the modern world, you see the Nansen legacy living on in every digital hack and every grassroots effort to help the displaced. You realize that the starch-stained hands are still at work today, wherever the official truth is used as a weapon against the innocent. You are part of a lineage of people who believe that a human life is worth more than the paper it's written on. You've learned that the greatest forgery isn't the document itself, but the belief that we are powerless in the face of authority. You recall the crocodile dung philosophy one last time, the idea that the most profound victories are often found in the most overlooked places. In this final reflection, that place is your own heart. You've walked in the boots of the courier, sat at the bench of the carver, and felt the panic of the checkpoint. You've seen that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to keep your hand steady while carving a wingtip in a root vegetable. You've earned the right to look at a simple potato and see a weapon of liberation. A fringe scholarly debate phrase to leave you with is the ontological defiance of the object. It's the idea that a thing of potato, a needle, a scrap of wool can, choose to be something other than what it was intended to be. You've seen a vegetable become a seal, a book speen become a safe, and a lie become a life. You've witnessed the transformation of the mundane into the miraculous. You are no longer just a listener. You are a witness to the hidden stories of the starch-stained hands. As the final light of our journey fades, you feel a sense of profound, quiet pride. You have honored the master forgers by remembering their craft. You have walked through the shadows and come out the other side with a deeper understanding of what it means to survive. You look at your own hands, clean, safe, and still. But you know that if the world ever turned upside down again, you'd know exactly where to find the tools for a new beginning. You'd head to the pantry, grab a knife, and start carving. The rhythmic thud of the jackboots has long since faded, and the sharp tannic scent of the walnut ink has softened into the gentle fragrance of the night around you. You can feel the weight of the day lifting, moving like a slow tide away from the stone walls of the basement and the deep shadows of the Nalaboki pines. The Frankenstein typewriter is silent now, its keys at rest, and the Holy Grail paper is tucked safely into the archives of your mind. There are no more checkpoints to face, no more deadlines to meet, and no more white lies to weave. The world has returned to its natural state, where a potato is just a potato, and the only truth you need is the steady, rhythmic beat of your own heart. As the hum of the fan becomes a soft, velvet backdrop, you can imagine the forest canopy closing over the Zmlianka, protecting the secrets of the lions of Judah in a blanket of green and moss. The master forgers have laid down their needles, their starch-stained hands finally resting in the stillness of a hard-won peace. You are safe, you are held, and the story of the paper wars is a treasure you carry into the quiet. Let the images of the carved eagles and the shimmering watermarks dissolve into the soft gray of a dreamless sleep. The shadows are no longer a place of hiding, but a place of rest. The ink has dried, the seal is set, and the journey is complete. Rest now in the sanctuary of the forgotten and the saved.